The room brightens not with a sudden burst of daylight, but through a slow seepage of grey that collects first in the corners near the ceiling before it ventures down the walls. You are not asleep any longer, and you are not fully awake because there is no great reason to choose one state over the other. The blanket rests across your legs with a weight that is both familiar and comforting, its wool fibers worn smooth in places where hands have pulled it up 1,000 times. Outside the narrow window, the sky has taken on the particular shade of a pewter plate left too long in the dishwater, a color that holds no promise of sun, but also no threat of hard rain. A factory whistle sounds somewhere to the east, a thin and reedy cry that travels over the rooftops and through the chimneys, but does not concern you. That whistle calls to other men in other rooms, men who must now swing their legs out of bed and find their boots and hurry down the stairs into the cold. You remain where you are, listening to the sound fade into the distance until it is swallowed by the more immediate noises of the lodging house stirring around you. The floorboards above your head emit a series of slow creaks as Mr. Harrow in the upper room begins his own morning routine. You know the pattern of his steps by now, because you have been here long enough to memorize the map of sounds that define this place. 3 steps from the bed to the washstand, followed by a pause while he stares at the cracked basin, then 2 steps to the window and back again. The rhythm is as predictable as the ticking of a clock if you had a clock, which you do not. You let your eyes rest on the ceiling, where a dark watermark spreads outward from the corner in the shape of a lopsided continent. The stain has been there since before you arrived, and it will be there long after you leave, whenever that might be. It does not grow or shrink or change color. It simply exists in the same way that you simply exist in this room on this morning, with no particular destination ahead of you. After a length of time that you cannot measure with any precision, you decide to push the blanket aside and place your feet on the cold boards. The floor is always cold, even in summer, because the stone foundation of the building holds the chill of the earth and passes it upward through the joists and into the soles of your feet. You have a pair of socks that you knit yourself during the last long winter when there was nothing else to do, and you pull them on slowly, one after the other, taking care to align the heel seam correctly against your skin. This small act of attention fills a moment that might otherwise be empty, and you find that many of your mornings are built from such moments stacked one atop the next, like the layers of sediment in a riverbank. You stand and cross to the window where the glass is fogged with the breath of the night. You wipe a clear circle in the condensation with the side of your hand and peer out at the street below. The street is a narrow channel between rows of brick houses that lean toward one another as if sharing some private and weary conversation. A thin fog clings to the cobblestones and softens the edges of the doorways across the way. You can see Mrs. Pritchard shaking out a small rug from her second-floor window, and the dust motes catch the grey light and drift downward like a slow snowfall of tiny grey specks. Farther along the lane a cart stands motionless, with its horse equally motionless, while the driver sits hunched on his seat reading a scrap of newspaper that he holds close to his face. Nothing moves with any urgency because nothing here requires urgency. The morning will unfold in its own time, and the afternoon will arrive when it is ready, and the evening will follow as it always does. You turn from the window and look at the room itself. It is a modest space containing a bed with an iron frame that has been painted brown many years ago and now shows flecks of rust where the paint has chipped away, a wooden chair with a straight back and a seat worn smooth by previous occupants, a small table pushed against the wall beneath the window, and a narrow wardrobe that leans slightly to the left because one of its feet is missing and has been replaced with a folded piece of cardboard. On the table sits a chipped enamel cup and a small tin that holds your supply of tea leaves. Beside the cup rests a shirt that you began mending yesterday afternoon and set aside when the light grew too dim for fine work. The shirt is made of a sturdy cotton weave that has softened over years of washing and wear, but the right cuff has frayed along the edge where it rubs against the sleeve of your coat. You pick up the shirt and the needle still threaded with dark cotton, and you carry them to the chair by the window. Settling into the chair involves a careful negotiation with its particular angles, because the back is not quite vertical and the seat is not quite horizontal, and you have learned through trial the exact posture that allows you to sit for an hour without developing a soreness in your lower spine. You arrange the shirt across your lap and locate the spot where you left off. A line of small even stitches that travel along the edge of the cuff, binding the frayed threads back into the main fabric. The needle feels small and cool between your fingers, and you position it at the next point of entry. You push the point through the cloth and pull the thread after it with a soft whispering sound that is the loudest thing in the room besides your own breathing. Then you reverse direction and push the needle back up through the underside and pull again. The rhythm establishes itself without any conscious effort on your part. Push and pull, and the soft rasp of thread passing through cotton. Push and pull, and the slow accumulation of tiny stitches that march along the cuff in an orderly line. While your hands perform this task, your eyes have leave to wander, and they find the familiar landmarks of the room once more. There is a particular knot in the floorboard near the foot of the bed that you've studied many times before. It is shaped like a closed eye, or perhaps like the seed of some large fruit, and the wood grain swirls around it in concentric rings that remind you of the maps you once saw in a book at the Free Library, the ones that show ocean currents with curling arrows. Next to the knot, there is a small dent, where something heavy was dropped long ago, and the dent has collected a tiny accumulation of dust and lint that you have never bothered to clean because it harms no one, and its presence is a kind of company. The wall opposite the window has a crack that runs from the top of the baseboard upward for about 12 inches before it stops abruptly as if it lost interest in its own journey. You have wondered what caused that crack, and whether it happened all at once or slowly over years, and you'll never know the answer, and this lack of knowledge does not trouble you. Outside the window, the street has not changed in any noticeable way. The same cart and horse remain in the same position, and the driver is now folding his newspaper into a precise square and tucking it inside his coat. A second figure has appeared, a man in a flat cap and a coat that is too large for his frame, walking slowly along the far side of the lane with his hands pushed deep into his pockets. He stops every few steps to examine the ground as if he has lost something small and valuable, but you know from watching other men walk this same route that he is not searching for anything in particular. He is simply moving because movement is better than standing still, and standing still is better than nothing. You watch him until he passes out of your view beyond the edge of the window frame, and then your attention returns to the stitching in your hands. The cuff is nearly finished now. Only a small section remains, and you complete it with the same steady pace that you maintain throughout the rest of the seam. When the final stitch is in place, you tie off the thread with a small neat knot and bite the excess length away with your teeth. You hold the shirt up to the light and examine your work. The mend is not invisible, but it is strong and tidy, and the shirt will serve for many more months before another repair becomes necessary. You fold the shirt carefully along the creases that have been ironed into it by years of wear, and you place it on the table next to the enamel cup. The mending has occupied perhaps an hour of your morning, or perhaps only 40 minutes, or perhaps an hour and a half because you have no way to know, and the specific duration does not matter. What matters is that the task is done, and another small segment of the day has passed peacefully. You rise from the chair, and your knees make a soft popping sound that you have grown accustomed to hearing. You stretch your arms above your head and feel the muscles in your shoulders lengthen and relax. The room is now fully illuminated by the grey daylight that seems to come from all directions at once, without casting any distinct shadows. This is the kind of light that painters call flat, and it renders everything with an equal clarity, so that the dust on the tabletop is as visible as the grain in the wooden floorboards, and the watermark on the ceiling is as plain as the iron bed frame. There is a comfort in this evenness, because nothing calls attention to itself, and nothing demands your focus. You can let your gaze drift from object to object without any sense of urgency or purpose. You decide to make a cup of tea. This involves a small ritual that you have refined over the weeks to extract the maximum amount of satisfaction from limited means. You take the enamel cup and carry it to the communal washroom at the end of the hallway, where a tap protrudes from the wall and drips a constant slow rhythm onto the stone basin below. You fill the cup halfway with cold water and return to your room. You have a small spirit stove that you keep on the floor near the wardrobe, and you set the cup upon its iron grate. The fuel is a bit of methylated spirits that you purchase in small quantities from the chandler's shop 2 streets over, and you pour a careful measure into the reservoir. You strike a match from the box that you keep dry inside your coat pocket and touch the flame to the wick. A small blue flame appears and wraps itself around the base of the cup. You sit back on the edge of the bed and watch the water begin its slow journey toward boiling. The sound of the flame is a steady hiss that blends with the dripping tap down the hall and the distant murmur of voices from other rooms where other people are passing their own mornings in similar quiet ways. You listen without trying to distinguish words because the words are not important. What matters is the tone, which is low and unhurried and carries no anger or excitement. The lodging house holds a dozen tenants at present, and all of them are people who have learned to move through their days without making unnecessary noise. The walls are thin, and everyone knows everyone else's business, whether they wish to or not, so there is an unspoken agreement to keep sounds to a minimum. You appreciate this courtesy, and you return it in kind. The water in the cup begins to shiver, and small bubbles form along the bottom and sides. You watch them grow and detach and rise to the surface, where they burst with tiny popping sounds that are nearly inaudible. When the water reaches a proper boil, you remove the cup from the stove using a folded rag to protect your fingers, and you set it on the table. From the small tin, you measure out a pinch of tea leaves and drop them into the hot water. The leaves unfurl and sink, and release a thin brown color that spreads through the cup like fog, spreading through the morning street. You let it steep while you stare out the window at nothing in particular, and then you lift the cup to your lips and take the first sip. The tea is weak and slightly bitter, and it warms your throat and settles in your stomach with a gentle weight. You hold the cup in both hands and feel the heat transfer into your palms, and you think about nothing that requires any effort to think about. Outside, the street has gained a few more figures. Two women stand near the corner speaking to one another in voices that you cannot hear through the glass, and they gesture occasionally with their hands in ways that suggest conversation about ordinary things, such as the price of bread or the health of a neighbor's child. A boy walks past pushing a small cart laden with sacks, and he whistles a tune that you almost recognize but cannot quite name. The horse that has stood so patiently for so long finally lifts one hoof and sets it down again, and then resumes its perfect stillness. The driver has closed his eyes and appears to be dozing in his seat with his chin resting on his chest. The fog has lifted slightly, and the rooftops across the way are now visible with their dark slate tiles and the occasional chimney pot that issues no smoke because the fires within have been banked for the day. You finish the tea and set the empty cup back on the table. There is no hurry to wash it now. It can wait until later or until tomorrow because there is no one who will inspect your housekeeping and no schedule that requires a clean cup at any particular hour. You sit on the edge of the bed once more and let your weight settle into the mattress. The morning has passed from its earliest grey stage into a fuller daylight that is still grey but of a slightly lighter quality. You can now see the details of the watermark on the ceiling with greater clarity, and you notice a small new feature that you had not observed before, a thin line branching off from the main stain like a tributary leaving a river. You follow its path with your eyes until it disappears behind the line of the wall, and you wonder whether it continues into the next room and whether the tenant there has noticed it as well. The sounds of the house have shifted as the morning progresses. Mr. Mater Harrow has descended the stairs with his heavy tread, and the front door opened and closed with a soft thud. Another tenant whose name you do not know is coughing in the room next to yours with a dry, repetitive sound that comes every 20 seconds or so. The dripping tap continues its patient work. From somewhere far away comes the sound of another factory whistle blowing a different note for a different shift in a different part of the city. You listen to these sounds as a person might listen to a piece of music that has no melody, but still contains a kind of order. They layer over one another, and then separate, and then layer again, and the effect is soothing in its monotony. You lie back on the bed, and let your head rest on the pillow that still holds the shape of your earlier hours. The ceiling is very close above you, and you can see the texture of the plaster, where the trowel left faint swirls many decades ago. You trace these swirls with your eyes from left to right, and then back again from right to left. There is no need to rise and no need to act and no need to be anywhere other than exactly where you are. The day will continue in this manner until the light begins to fail and the room returns to shadow, and you will light the candle stub that you keep in a holder on the floor, and you will watch the small flame dance and flicker, and you will listen to the house settle into night. But that is still many hours away, and for now there is only the soft grey morning and the weight of your own body on the thin mattress, and the distant sound of the city continuing its quiet life without you. The morning has grown old enough that the grey light now holds a faint suggestion of warmth, even though the air itself remains cool against your cheeks. You have left the lodging house behind and closed the door with a soft click that sounded very final in the narrow hallway. The street outside is the same street you observed from your window, but now you stand within it rather than above it, and the difference in perspective is a small thing that nonetheless feels significant. The cobblestones are uneven beneath the thin soles of your boots, and you can feel each rounded stone pressing upward through the worn leather with a distinct and individual pressure. You adjust your weight automatically after so many months of walking these same lanes, and your feet find the flattest stones without any conscious direction from your mind. The air carries a mixture of smells that define this part of the city. Coal smoke from the chimneys that are still active mingles with the damp odor of the canal that runs parallel to the main thoroughfare a few streets over. There is also the faint sourness of refuse that has not yet been collected, and the earthy smell of horse droppings that have been ground into the crevices between the stones. None of these smells are unpleasant, exactly because you have grown accustomed to them, in the same way that you have grown accustomed to the grey light and the sound of dripping taps. They are simply the background notes of a place where industry has paused, but not fully departed, leaving behind its signature in the air, and in the stone, and in the weary faces of the people who remain. You turn left at the corner where the baker's shop stands, with its shutters closed, at a small handwritten sign in the window that reads "Bread Tomorrow" in letters that have faded from repeated exposure to the damp. The sign has said "Bread Tomorrow" for the past 6 days, and you have learned not to expect anything different when you pass this way. The baker himself is an old man who lost his assistant to the workhouse and his son to the railway yards in another county, and he now bakes only when he can afford the flour, which is not often. You do not know his name, and he does not know yours, and this mutual anonymity is a comfortable arrangement that requires no effort to maintain. You continue walking past the shuttered shop, and your footsteps echo softly off the brick walls that line the narrow passage. The lane opens onto a wider street that runs alongside the canal. This is the route you have chosen for your morning stroll, because it offers a view of water that moves so slowly it might as well be standing still. The canal is a dark ribbon of greenish-brown that reflects the grey sky above with perfect fidelity, so that the boundary between water and air becomes difficult to discern. A narrow towpath runs along the near bank, bordered on one side by the water and on the other by a low stone wall that separates the path from a row of abandoned warehouses. The warehouses are built of the same dark brick as the lodging house, and their windows are blank and empty, like the eyes of a person who has stopped paying attention to the world. Some of the panes are broken, and some are intact, but all of them reveal nothing but darkness within. You step onto the towpath and begin walking at a pace that cannot be described as purposeful. Your legs move because moving is what legs do when a person is standing upright, and the alternative would be to stand still, which you could do just as easily in your room. But there is something about the canal that draws you out on mornings like this, something about the slow progress of the water and the way the light falls on its surface in long pale streaks that shift and reform with each passing cloud. You watch the water as you walk, and you notice a small piece of wood floating near the far bank. A fragment of a packing crate, perhaps, that has been travelling the same slow circuit for days. You have seen it before on previous walks, and you recognize the particular angle at which it floats, with one end slightly higher than the other. It moves perhaps 6 inches in the time it takes you to walk 20 feet, and this disparity in speed is something you find yourself contemplating without any particular conclusion. The towpath ahead of you is empty except for a single figure in the distance, a man who stands at the edge of the water with a long pole in his hands. As you draw closer, you see that he is not fishing, but rather poking at something in the shallows, a tangle of rope or perhaps a submerged branch that has caught his attention. He does not look up as you pass, and you do not speak to him, because there is nothing that needs to be said. The sound of the pole, disturbing the water, is a soft plash and gurgle that joins the other quiet noises of the canal. Farther along, a duck paddles in slow circles near the opposite bank, trailing a small V-shaped wake that spreads and fades and disappears. The duck does not seem to have any particular destination either, and you feel a small kinship with it that you do not examine too closely. The canal makes a gentle bend to the left, and as you round the curve, you come within sight of the mill. It is a large building constructed of the same dark brick as everything else in this district, but on a grander scale, with 5 stories rising above the water and a tall chimney that stands at one end like a sentinel. The chimney is not smoking today, and it has not smoked for many weeks. The windows of the mill are dark, and the great wooden gates that face the canal are closed and barred with a heavy iron chain that hangs in a loose curve between the two doors. In front of these gates a small group of men has gathered, and they stand in poses that suggest long practice at the art of waiting. You slow your pace as you approach, not because you intend to join them, but because the scene holds a quiet fascination that you cannot entirely explain. The men number perhaps a dozen or 15, and they are arranged in loose clusters along the wall that borders the mill yard. Some stand with their backs against the brick, with their arms folded across their chests and their eyes fixed on the middle distance. Others have chosen to lean against the iron railing that separates the towpath from the water, and they stare down at the canal, as if expecting some message to rise from its murky depths. One man sits on an upturned crate that he has carried from somewhere, and he whittles at a stick with a small knife, making thin curls of pale wood that accumulate around his boots like fallen leaves. Another man paces slowly back and forth along a 10-foot stretch of path, with his hands clasped behind his back and his head bowed in thought. You find a spot against the stone wall a short distance away from the main group, and you settle yourself into a position that you can maintain for a long time without discomfort. Your shoulder rests against the rough brick, and your weight shifts onto your right leg while your left leg bends slightly at the knee. This is a posture you've perfected over many hours of waiting in many different locations, and it allows you to remain upright and alert while expending the minimum possible energy. From this vantage point, you can observe the men at the mill gates without appearing to observe them, and you can also watch the canal and the towpath and the grey sky above. The men do not speak much. When words do pass between them, they are offered in low tones that do not carry far, and they concern practical matters such as the likelihood of rain later in the day or the rumour that the mill owner has gone to London to seek new investors. You hear fragments of these conversations without trying to hear them because the air is so still that sounds travel farther than they normally would. Said he might be back by Tuesday, one man murmurs to another, and the response is a non-committal grunt that could mean anything or nothing. The topic of the mill reopening is discussed in the same flat tone that one might use to discuss the price of turnips, because hope has been stretched so thin over the past months that it has become transparent and weightless and no longer capable of generating any real emotion. You study the faces of the waiting men without staring directly at any one of them. Their features share certain common characteristics that you have learned to recognize in this part of the city. The skin has a greyish cast from too many meals of bread and weak broth and too few hours in direct sunlight. The eyes are set in a permanent squint from years of peering at fine work in dim light, and the lines around them are deeper than the years of the men themselves would suggest. Their hands are rough and scarred with the marks of their trades, and they hang at their sides or rest in pockets or grip the railing with a force that is not conscious but habitual. These are the hands of weavers and spinners and carders, hands that know the feel of cotton thread and the vibration of a working loom, and they have been idle for so long that their owners sometimes flex them open and closed, as if reminding themselves that the fingers still function. The mill building looms above the scene with the patient indifference of a sleeping giant. Its brick walls are stained with decades of soot that have accumulated in vertical streaks below each windowsill where rainwater has channeled the grime downward. The windows themselves are divided into small panes by wooden muntins, and many of the panes are coated with a fine grey dust that obscures whatever lies within. You imagine the interior of the mill as you have seen it described by men who worked there before the stoppage, the long rows of spinning frames and looms standing silent under canvas covers, the wooden floors coated with a thin film of cotton fluff that no one sweeps away, the leather belts hanging loose from their pulleys like the shed skins of snakes. The machinery waits in the darkness, with a patience that matches the patience of the men outside, and neither party knows when the waiting will end. A barge appears around the bend of the canal, moving so slowly that at first you mistake it for a stationary object that has somehow drifted into view. It is a low flat vessel piled with coal that rises in a black mound above the gunwales, and a single horse plods along the towpath, pulling it with a rope that dips into the water and rises again with each step. The horse is a heavy animal with feathered feet and a patient expression, and it walks with its head low and its ears relaxed. The bargeman stands at the tiller in the stern, with one hand resting on the wooden handle and his gaze fixed on some point far ahead. He does not look at the men gathered by the mill gates, and they do not look at him because each party belongs to a different category of existence. The bargeman is working, and the men are waiting, and the two conditions do not intersect. You watch the barge pass with the same slow attention that you have given to everything else this morning. The water parts around the blunt bow with a soft hissing sound and reforms behind the stern in a swirling pattern that smooths itself out within a few yards. The wake reaches the bank where you stand and laps against the stone with small wet sounds that are almost like whispers. The coal on the barge glistens faintly where the light catches its facets, and you can smell its dusty mineral scent as the vessel draws abreast of your position. Then it is past, and the horse continues its plodding progress along the towpath, and the bargeman continues his silent vigil at the tiller, and the canal returns to its previous stillness. The men at the mill gates have shifted their positions slightly in the time you have been watching. The man with the whittling stick has finished his project, whatever it was, and has tucked the knife away in his pocket. He now holds a small wooden shape in his palm, and he turns it over and over with his thumb, studying it from all angles. The man who was pacing has stopped pacing and has joined the group, leaning against the wall with his shoulders hunched against the cold that is not severe but persistent. A new figure has arrived from the direction of the town. A younger man with a thin scarf wrapped around his neck and his hands pushed deep into the pockets of a coat that is too large for him. He nods to the others as he approaches and receives a few nods in return, and then he finds a space against the wall and settles into his own posture of waiting. You notice that no one asks the newcomer if there is any news. The question has been asked too many times, and the answer has always been the same, and so the question has been retired from use like a worn-out tool that no longer serves its purpose. The men know that if there were news, they would hear it soon enough, and if there is no news, then there is nothing to discuss. The silence that settles over the group is not uncomfortable, but rather familiar and even restful in its way. You close your eyes for a moment and let the sounds of the canal wash over you. The gentle lap of water against stone, and the distant cry of a gull that has wandered inland from the coast, and the faint creak of the iron chain that holds the mill gates closed as the wind moves it slightly back and forth. When you open your eyes again, the light has shifted in the subtle way that marks the slow passage of the morning toward noon. The grey has lightened by a few degrees, and the shadows beneath the mill wall have shortened by a small measure. You can feel the chill of the stone through your coat where your shoulder rests against it, and you decide that you have been still long enough. You straighten your legs and feel the stiffness in your knees protest briefly before subsiding. None of the waiting men look at you as you prepare to leave because you are not part of their group, and your departure is a matter of no consequence. You are simply another person who paused to rest against a wall on a grey morning and who will now continue along the towpath toward whatever destination presents itself. You resume walking, and your footsteps carry you past the mill gates and past the small gathering of silent men. As you draw level with the nearest figure, you catch a glimpse of his face in profile, and you see that his eyes are closed and his lips are moving slightly, as if he is reciting something to himself. Perhaps a prayer or a poem or a list of things he needs to remember. You do not know, and you will never know, and this lack of knowledge is as comfortable as the anonymity of the baker with his bread tomorrow sign. You continue walking, and the mill recedes behind you, and the canal continues its slow journey alongside. The towpath stretches ahead in a straight line for some distance before it curves again around another bend. The warehouses on your right give way to a row of small cottages that face the water with tiny gardens squeezed between their front doors and the path. The gardens are mostly bare earth at this time of year, with a few hardy stalks of kale or cabbage standing in neat rows. A woman in a faded apron kneels in one of these gardens, pulling weeds from the soil with slow, deliberate movements that remind you of your own stitching from earlier in the morning. She does not look up as you pass, and you do not greet her. The understanding between strangers in this place is the words are for necessary things, and everything else can remain unspoken. You walk until you reach a low bridge where the towpath passes beneath an arch of damp stone. The underside of the bridge is dark and cool, and your footsteps echo in the enclosed space with a hollow sound that makes you aware of your own presence in a way that the open path did not. Water drips from somewhere above and forms a small puddle on the path that you step around automatically. On the other side of the bridge, the canal opens out into a wider basin where several barges are moored in a loose cluster. None of them show any signs of activity, and their crews are nowhere to be seen. The water in the basin is even stiller than the water in the canal, and it reflects the grey sky with a perfect glassy surface that is disturbed only by the occasional ripple from a submerged fish or a falling leaf. You find a low stone block at the edge of the basin that serves as a mounting step for barge horses, and you sit down upon it. The stone is cold through your trousers, but you have grown accustomed to cold surfaces, and you adjust your position until you find a comfortable arrangement. From this seat, you can watch the basin and the barges and the slow drift of the clouds above. The morning has reached that point where it is no longer morning but not yet afternoon, a suspended interval that belongs to neither category. You let your gaze rest on the nearest barge, which is named Perseverance, in faded white letters on its bow. The name seems appropriate for this place and this time, and you repeat it silently to yourself a few times until the word loses its meaning and becomes just a collection of sounds. The sounds of the basin are fewer and softer than the sounds of the canal. There is no traffic here and no gathering of waiting men. Only the quiet slap of water against wooden hulls and the creak of mooring ropes as the barges shift almost imperceptibly with some invisible current. A bird sings somewhere in the distance with a short repeated phrase that it offers again and again without variation. You listen to the bird and watch the water and feel the cold of the stone gradually seep through your clothing and into your skin. This sensation is not unpleasant because it reminds you that you are still present in your body and that your body is still capable of feeling things even when your mind has grown quiet and still. After a time that you do not measure, you rise from the stone block and brush the grit from your trousers. The walk back to the lodging house will take you along the same towpath past the same mill gates and the same silent men. Perhaps the scene will have changed slightly by the time you pass again. Perhaps one of the men will have gone home to his own room and his own window. Perhaps another will have arrived to take his place against the wall. The waiting continues whether you are there to observe it or not, and this thought is somehow comforting in its predictability. You begin the slow walk back and your footsteps fall into a rhythm that matches the pace of the canal water and the drift of the grey clouds and the quiet turning of the unseen world around you. The afternoon has settled over the city with a weight that is more felt than seen, a slow compression of the grey light into something denser and more substantial. You have walked from the canal basin back toward the centre of the district, where the streets grow narrower and the buildings press closer together. Your feet have carried you along a route that you know without thinking about it, a path that winds past the shuttered shops and the closed mill gates and the rows of soot-stained houses with their blank windows and their patient silence. Now you find yourself on a broader thoroughfare, where the cobblestones are worn into shallow ruts by the passage of countless cartwheels, and the foot traffic is heavier than it was along the towpath. People move in both directions, with the slow, purposeful gait of those who have errands to complete, but no great urgency in completing them. You join this flow and allow it to carry you forward without any particular destination in mind. The street opens into a small square that is dominated on one side by a large building constructed of the same dark brick as everything else in this part of the city. The building is set back from the road behind a low iron railing, and its facade is punctuated by tall, narrow windows that are covered on the inside with a film of grime and condensation. A stone plaque above the main entrance bears words that have been eroded by weather until they are nearly illegible, but you know what they say because you have read them many times before. This is the office of the Poor Law Union, the place where relief is administered according to rules that are printed in small type on notices posted beside the door. The notices are the reason that a small crowd has gathered on the pavement outside, a crowd that shifts and shuffles and breathes plumes of visible vapor into the cold afternoon air. You slow your pace as you approach the edge of the crowd. The people here are arranged in a loose queue that snakes back from the door along the iron railing and then doubles upon itself like a folded ribbon. There are perhaps 30 or 40 individuals standing in this line, and they occupy the space with the same quiet patience that you observed earlier at the mill gates. The faces are familiar in their general characteristics, even if the specific features vary. The greyish skin and the deep-set eyes and the mouths set in lines that have forgotten how to smile easily. Men and women stand together without distinction, because need does not discriminate, and the queue welcomes all who have nowhere else to go. A few children cling to their mothers' skirts and stare at the ground or at the backs of the people ahead of them, with the wide vacant gaze of those who have learned to wait before they learn to walk. You find a place at the end of the queue and you settle into the familiar posture of waiting. Your weight shifts onto your back foot, and your hands find their way into your coat pockets where they can rest without purpose. The person ahead of you is a woman of middle years wearing a shawl that has been mended so many times that the original fabric is nearly lost beneath the patches. She stands with her shoulders slightly hunched and her head bowed as if she is reading something on the ground that only she can see. The person behind you arrives a moment later and takes up a position with a soft exhalation of breath that speaks of a long walk and tired feet. No words are exchanged because the queue is not a place for conversation. It is a place for waiting, and waiting requires silence. Your gaze drifts to the notices posted beside the door. They are sheets of paper that have been affixed to a wooden board with small tacks, and they have suffered from their exposure to the elements. The paper has wrinkled and softened from repeated soakings of rain and fog, and the ink has faded to a pale brown that is difficult to distinguish from the background. You can see the shapes of words and the blocks of text arranged in orderly paragraphs, but the specific meaning is obscured by the distance and the decay. You know what the notices say because you have read them before on previous visits when you stood closer to the board and squinted at the letters until they resolved into sense. The top notice announces the hours during which relief applications will be received, which are Tuesday and Thursday mornings from 9 until noon, and Friday afternoons from 2 until 4. The middle notice lists the types of relief available, which include outdoor relief in the form of bread or small sums of money, and indoor relief, which requires residence in the workhouse. The bottom notice is a warning printed in slightly larger type that reminds applicants of the penalties for making false statements about their circumstances. You do not need to read these words again because they are engraved in your memory, and you suspect they are engraved in the memory of everyone standing in this queue. The queue moves forward by a small increment. The person at the front of the line has been admitted through the door, and the rest of the line shuffles forward to fill the gap. The movement is slow and collective, like the motion of a single large creature shifting in its sleep. You take 2 steps forward and then stop again, and your weight settles back into its waiting posture. The woman ahead of you takes 2 steps and stops, and the person behind you does the same. This rhythm repeats itself every few minutes, and each repetition is identical to the one before it. The waiting becomes a kind of trance in which the passage of time is marked only by these small advances toward a door that remains obstinately distant. You let your attention wander to the details of the scene around you. The iron railing that separates the building from the pavement is painted black, but the paint has flaked away in patches to reveal the reddish-brown rust beneath. Each vertical bar is topped with a simple spear point that has been blunted by decades of weather, and the horizontal rails are worn smooth where countless hands have rested upon them. The stone steps leading up to the door are dished in the center from the tread of innumerable feet, and a thin layer of mud has been tracked onto them from the street. The door itself is made of heavy dark wood, reinforced with iron straps, and it swings inward when opened with a groan that you can hear even from your position at the back of the queue. Each time the door opens, a small gust of warm air escapes from within, carrying the smell of coal smoke and damp wool, and something else that might be boiled cabbage, or might be the general odor of institutional life. The person who's been admitted emerges after a length of time that varies from one case to the next. Some emerge quickly with their faces set in expressions that reveal nothing of what transpired inside. Others take longer, and when they finally appear they pause on the top step to tuck a piece of paper into a pocket, or to adjust a shawl, or to stare at the grey sky as if seeking an answer that the officials within could not provide. You watch these exits with the same detached interest that you might give to the movements of clouds or the drifting of a leaf on the canal. There is no point in speculating about the outcomes of these interviews, because each case is different, and the rules that govern relief are as intricate and unknowable as the grain in the floorboards of your room. The queue moves forward again, and you take your 2 steps and stop. You are now close enough to the notice board that you could read the faded words if you chose to, but you do not choose to. Instead, you find yourself studying the surface of the wall beside the board, where someone has scratched a series of marks into the brick with a sharp stone. The marks are a simple tally consisting of vertical lines arranged in groups of 5, with a diagonal slash across each group. You cannot know who made these marks, or what they were counting, but you can imagine a person standing in this same queue week after week and scratching a line for each visit until the wall bore a permanent record of their patience. The tally has been partially effaced by weather and by other marks added by other hands, but you can still discern perhaps 30 groups of 5 which would represent 150 visits. The number is large enough to be meaningless and small enough to be conceivable, and you let it settle into your mind without judgment. The afternoon light has begun its slow decline toward evening, and the grey has taken on a slightly bluer cast. The shadows beneath the iron railing have lengthened, and the faces of the people in the queue have grown harder to read as the light flattens and fades. A man near the middle of the line has produced a small book from his coat, and he holds it close to his face as he reads, moving his lips silently over the words. A woman farther ahead has sat down on the low stone base of the railing, and she rests her chin on her hand, with her eyes half closed. The children who are clinging to their mothers have grown restless, and one small boy kicks at a loose cobblestone with the toe of his boot, producing a soft scraping sound that repeats at irregular intervals. No one tells him to stop, because the sound is not loud enough to disturb the general quiet, and it provides a small point of focus for those whose thoughts have grown too diffuse. The door opens and closes again, and the queue advances by another 2 steps. You are now near enough to see the faces of the people at the front more clearly. A man in a threadbare coat stands with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly around and around by the brim. His hair is thin and grey, and his scalp shows through in patches that are the colour of old parchment. He does not look at anyone, and no one looks at him. When the door opens, he steps forward and disappears inside, and the queue closes behind him like water filling a depression in the canal. You watch the door swing shut and listen to the groan of its hinges, and then you return your gaze to the wall and the tally marks and the slow erosion of the afternoon. The person ahead of you has shifted her weight from one foot to the other, and this small movement draws your attention. She wears a pair of boots that have been resoled multiple times, with leather patches of different colours, and the stitching that holds these patches in place is visible where the thread has pulled through the worn upper. You notice these details without meaning to, because your eyes must rest somewhere and the boots are directly in your line of sight. The boots are planted on the cobblestones with a certain firmness, as if their owner has decided that she will stand here for as long as necessary and will not be moved by wind or weather or the slow passage of hours. You find something admirable in this firmness even as you recognize it in yourself. The queue moves again, and now you are close enough to read the notices if you wish to read them. The paper has buckled where moisture has seeped beneath the surface, and the ink has spread in places to create small halos around each letter. The words are still legible if you concentrate, and you find yourself doing so almost against your will. Applications for relief will be received on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 9 o'clock in the forenoon until 12 o'clock, and on Fridays from 2 o'clock until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The sentence is long and contains several clauses, and you read it twice without any conscious decision to do so. The words are familiar, and they arrange themselves in your mind in the same order that they have always occupied. You move your eyes to the next paragraph. Relief may be granted in the form of bread or other provisions, or in money not exceeding 2 shillings and 6pence per week for each adult and 1 shilling per week for each child under the age of 12 years. The numbers are precise, and they represent a calculation that someone has made in a warm office far from this cold pavement. You read the words, and you let them pass through you without resistance, because resistance would require energy that you prefer to conserve. The door opens, and the man with the threadbare coat emerges. He pauses on the top step and puts his hat back on his head with a slow, deliberate motion, and then he descends the steps and walks away along the street without looking back. His face reveals nothing of what occurred inside, and you do not try to guess. The queue moves forward, and now you are only a few paces from the door. The woman ahead of you will enter next, and then you will be at the front, and then it will be your turn to step across the threshold into the warm air that smells of coal smoke and damp wool and boiled cabbage. You wait without impatience, because impatience would not make the door open any faster. The afternoon is already stretched into a shape that accommodates this waiting, and you have stretched with it. The woman ahead of you is admitted, and the door closes behind her. You are now at the front of the queue, and the person behind you has moved up to occupy the space you vacated. You can feel the presence of the queue at your back, like a gentle pressure that reminds you that others are waiting, and that your time at the front is a temporary privilege that will soon pass to the next person. You stand with your hands still in your pockets, and your weight still on your back foot, and you watch the door with the same patient attention that you have given to every other door and every other wall and every other stretch of water this day. The iron straps on the door are pitted with rust, and the wood around the handle is worn smooth and dark from the touch of countless hands. You notice these details, and you file them away in the same mental drawer where you keep the memory of the watermark on your ceiling and the knot in your floorboard and the tally marks on the brick wall. The door opens and the woman steps out. She passes you without meeting your eyes, and you step forward into the warm, dim interior of the building. The door closes behind you with a sound that is both final and temporary, and the queue outside continues its slow shuffle forward by another 2 steps. Inside the building, the air is thick and still, and the light comes from a single gas fixture that hisses softly overhead. A wooden bench runs along one wall, and a few people sit upon it, waiting for their own interviews. A clerk sits behind a high desk at the far end of the room, and he looks up as you enter, and then looks down again at the papers spread before him. You walk toward the desk, and your footsteps are muffled by the layer of dust and grime that coats the floorboards. The waiting has ended, and another kind of waiting has begun. But that is a matter for another hour and another chapter. For now there is only the warmth of the room and the soft hiss of the gas, and the slow, careful words that you will exchange with the clerk before you return to the grey street and the long walk back to your room, where the watermark on the ceiling waits for you like an old and patient friend. The door to the casual ward is not the same door through which you entered the relief office. That door stands behind you now in a different part of the city, and the memory of the clerk's face has already begun to fade into the general greyness of the afternoon. The door before you is made of heavy, unpainted planks that have warped slightly with age, so that a thin line of pale light shows around 3 of its 4 edges. The iron handle is cold and rough against your palm, and when you push the door swings inward with a sound that is less a groan and more a sigh, as if the building itself is weary of opening and closing and opening again. You step across the threshold and the door sighs shut behind you, and you are standing in the workhouse yard. The yard is a rectangular space enclosed on 3 sides by the dark brick walls of the workhouse buildings, and on the 4th side by a high perimeter wall that rises perhaps 12 feet above the packed earth floor. The wall is topped with a coping of flat stones that have settled unevenly over the years, creating a wavering line against the grey sky. The bricks of the wall are old and stained with the same vertical streaks of soot that mark every surface in this district. But here the streaks are interrupted by patches of pale green moss that grow in the sheltered crevices where moisture lingers longest. The ground beneath your feet is not paved with cobblestones, but rather with a layer of hard-packed earth mixed with cinders and small fragments of broken pottery that have been trodden into the surface over decades of use. The earth is dark and damp, and it yields slightly under your weight, with a soft resilience that is not unpleasant. The yard is not empty. Along one wall a row of wooden benches has been placed, and on these benches sit perhaps 20 or 25 people, arranged at intervals that allow each person enough room to work without touching their neighbours. The people are men and women of various ages, though most appear to be past the middle years of life, with a few younger faces scattered among them. They sit with their shoulders rounded and their heads bent over their laps, where their hands perform a task that you've seen before but never performed yourself. The task is the picking of oakum, and it is the reason you have been directed to this yard on this afternoon. You walk toward the benches, and your footsteps make a soft, crunching sound on the cinder-strewn earth that seems very loud in the general quiet of the space. A man in a dark coat stands near the end of the row of benches. He holds a clipboard in one hand and a stub of pencil in the other, and he watches your approach with the expression of someone who has seen too many people walk across this yard to take any particular interest in another. You stop before him and wait while he consults the paper on his clipboard, and then he points with the pencil toward an empty space at the end of the farthest bench. You nod and walk to the indicated spot and lower yourself onto the bench. The wood is smooth from long use, and it creaks softly as your weight settles upon it. To your left sits a man with thin grey hair and hands that are twisted with the knotted joints of age and toil. He does not look up as you arrive, and his fingers continue their work without pause. Before you, on the ground, rests a pile of old rope. The rope is of the kind used on ships and barges, thick and heavy and impregnated with tar that has turned it a dark brownish black. It has been cut into lengths of perhaps 3 feet, and these lengths have been coiled and stacked in a heap that reaches to the height of your knees. Beside the heap sits a smaller pile of the same rope that has already been partially processed, and next to that an empty space where the finished product will be placed. The finished product is oakum, a mass of loose fibers that have been separated from the twisted strands of the rope and fluffed into a soft, tangled cloud. You have seen oakum before in the hands of shipwrights and plumbers who use it to caulk seams and joints, but you have never produced it yourself. You reach down and take one of the partially processed lengths of rope and you hold it in your hands. The rope is heavier than it looks. The tar has stiffened the fibers into a rigid mass that resists bending, and the surface is slightly sticky to the touch, leaving a faint residue on your palms and fingers. You examine the end of the rope where the previous worker left off, and you see that the outer layer of twisted strands has been loosened and pulled apart to expose the inner core. The technique appears simple enough. You insert your fingernails into the gaps between the strands, and you pry them apart, and then you pull the individual fibers away from the main body of the rope. The fibers separate with a soft tearing sound that is accompanied by a faint crackling as the brittle tar coating breaks into tiny fragments. You pull a strand free and lay it on the pile of finished oakum, and then you insert your nails again and pull another strand. The work requires no thought. Your hands learn the motion within the first few minutes, and after that, your mind is free to wander while your fingers perform their repetitive task. The sound of oakum picking fills the yard with a constant low rustling, like the noise of a field of dry grass stirring in a light wind. 20 people pulling fibers from tarred rope produce a collective whisper that rises and falls as individual workers pause to rest their hands or to add to their piles or to select a fresh length of rope from the heap. Beneath this whisper you can hear other sounds. The creak of the benches as people shift their weight, and the occasional cough that echoes off the brick walls, and the distant clatter of a cart passing on the street beyond the high perimeter wall. The sounds blend together into a single texture that is as even and unvarying as the grey light that falls upon the yard. The smell of the work is strong but not unpleasant once you grow accustomed to it. The pine tar that saturates the rope releases a sharp resinous odor that fills your nostrils and lingers at the back of your throat. Mixed with this is the musty scent of old hemp and the earthy smell of the cinder floor and the faint sourness of many bodies gathered in a confined space. The smell wraps around you like a second coat, and after a while you cease to notice it except when a fresh length of rope is added to your pile and the tar scent blooms anew. The man to your left has been working at his pile for many hours, judging by the size of his finished oakum, which rises in a soft brown mound beside his knee. His fingers move with a mechanical precision that speaks of long practice, and he does not pause or vary his rhythm. You watch your own hands as they work. The tar has begun to darken your fingernails, and the creases of your knuckles have collected small deposits of black residue. The skin of your fingertips is growing tender from the constant friction, but not yet sore enough to require a pause. You pull another strand and another, and the pile of finished oakum grows by increments so small that you cannot detect the change from 1 minute to the next. If you look away and then look back after some interval, you can see that the pile has increased, but the increase is so gradual that it feels like a trick of the light. The heap of unprocessed rope, meanwhile, seems not to diminish at all. It remains the same dark mound that you first sat down beside, and you understand that you could work here for the rest of the afternoon and into the evening, and the heap would still be waiting for you. The high perimeter wall draws your attention as the afternoon wears on. The wall is not featureless. The bricks have been laid in a pattern that you can trace with your eyes, and the mortar between them has crumbled in places, leaving small gaps where spiders have spun their webs. The webs are grey with dust, and they tremble faintly in the breeze that you cannot feel, but which must exist somewhere above the level of the yard. A single strand of ivy has found a foothold near the top of the wall, and it trails downward for a few feet, before giving up and withering into a brown thread. You watch the wall for a long time, and then you return your gaze to your hands and the rope and the slow accumulation of fibers. The sun has appeared as a pale disk behind the grey clouds, and its position marks the passage of the afternoon. You can track its movement by the shadow of the high wall, which creeps across the yard with an almost imperceptible slowness. When you first sat down, the shadow covered the benches entirely, and the workers sat in a uniform dimness. Now the edge of the shadow has retreated by perhaps the width of your hand, and a thin band of slightly brighter grey has appeared along the base of the opposite wall. The light in this band is not warm and it casts no distinct shadows of its own, but it is different enough from the shade to serve as a measure of time. You watch the edge of the shadow advance across a particular stone in the wall, and you note its position, and then you work for a while, and when you look again, the edge has moved past the stone and is now touching the next stone in the row. The man to your left pauses in his work and reaches down to the ground beside his bench. He lifts a tin cup that you had not noticed before, and he drinks from it slowly with his eyes closed. The cup contains water that must have been drawn from the pump in the corner of the yard where a stone trough catches the overflow. When he finishes drinking, he sets the cup down again and resumes his picking without any change in his expression. You watch him for a moment, and then you look toward the pump yourself. A few other workers have risen from their benches and are standing near the trough, taking their own turns of the water. They move slowly and without speaking, and when they have drunk they return to their places and their hands resume the familiar motion. You decide to rise and join them. Standing up after sitting for so long sends a wave of stiffness through your legs and lower back, and you pause for a moment to let the sensation subside. The cinders crunch under your boots as you walk to the pump, and the sound seems very loud in the quiet yard, but no one looks up from their work. The pump handle is made of iron worn smooth by countless hands, and when you work it up and down, a stream of cold, clear water gushes from the spout and splashes into the trough. You cup your hands and fill them and bring the water to your lips. It tastes of iron and stone, and it is very cold, and it washes the taste of tar from your mouth. You drink until your thirst is satisfied, and then you let the remaining water fall back into the trough, and you return to your bench. The pile of finished oakum beside your knee has grown during your absence, or perhaps it only seems larger, because you are seeing it with fresh eyes. The fibers lie in a soft, tangled heap that is the color of weak coffee, with darker flecks where fragments of tar still cling to the strands. You reach into the pile and fluff it with your fingers, and the fibers separate and expand like a living thing, breathing in. The texture is coarse and springy, and you understand why it is valued for caulking, because it would fill a gap and swell when wet, and seal out the water. You release the fibers, and they slowly settle back into the heap, and you pick up another length of rope and resume your work. The afternoon has advanced to a point where the light has begun to change in quality, if not in quantity. The grey has deepened, and the shadows have softened, and the details of the yard are becoming harder to distinguish. The high wall no longer shows the individual bricks so clearly, and the faces of the other workers have blurred into a single composite of bent heads and moving hands. The sound of the oakum picking continues without pause, and it has become so familiar that you no longer hear it as a distinct noise, but rather as a silence of a particular kind. A silence that is full of small rustlings and creakings, and the soft whisper of fibre separating from fibre. A door opens somewhere in the building behind you, and the sound cuts through the quiet like a stone dropped into still water. Footsteps approach across the cinders, and you look up to see a woman in a grey dress and a white apron carrying a large wooden tray. The tray holds a collection of bowls, and the bowls contain something pale and steaming. The woman walks along the row of benches and places a bowl on the ground beside each worker, and when she reaches you, she sets a bowl down near your knee without speaking or meeting your eyes. The bowl is made of chipped earthenware, and it contains a portion of thin gruel that is the colour of old ivory. A few small lumps float on the surface, and a wisp of steam rises from the centre and fades into the grey air. You set down the rope and lift the bowl into your lap. The gruel is warm through the earthenware, and the warmth spreads into your hands and up your arms. You raise the bowl to your lips and take a small sip. The taste is mild and faintly sweet, with an undertone of the oats from which it was made, and a hint of salt that was added to the cooking water. It is not satisfying in the way that a proper meal might be, but it fills a space that you had stopped noticing, and the warmth settles in your stomach with a gentle weight. You drink the gruel slowly, because there is no reason to hurry, and because the warmth will last only as long as the liquid remains. Around you, the other workers are drinking their own portions, and the yard is filled with the soft sounds of swallowing and the clink of bowls against the ground. When the gruel is finished, you set the empty bowl beside you and wipe your mouth with the back of your hand. The tar residue has transferred from your fingers to your lips, and you taste its sharpness again. The woman with the tray returns and collects the empty bowls and carries them away through the same door, and the yard settles back into its previous quiet. You pick up the rope and your fingers find their rhythm again, and the pile of oakum continues its slow growth. The light is fading now in earnest. The grey has become a deeper shade that makes it difficult to see the individual fibers of the rope, and you find yourself working more by touch than by sight. The edge of the shadow has advanced across the yard until it covers everything, and the distinction between shade and light has disappeared entirely. The high wall is a dark shape against a darker sky, and the faces of the other workers are visible only as pale ovals in the gloom. The sound of the oakum picking has not diminished, and it continues with the same steady whisper that has accompanied the entire afternoon. A voice calls out from the direction of the door, and the words are indistinct, but their meaning is clear. The working day in the casual ward has ended. Around you the other workers set down their ropes and rise from the benches with the slow, careful movements of people whose bodies have been still for too long. They file toward the door, and you rise and join them, and your own body protests with the same familiar stiffness. The pile of oakum beside your bench is not as large as the pile of the man to your left, but it is larger than it was when you arrived, and this small fact is enough. You walk across the cinder floor toward the door, and the high wall watches you go with its blank face, and the yard behind you settles into the silence of the coming night. The door sighs open and sighs shut, and you are back in the grey street where the lamps are being lit one by one, and the city is preparing itself for another evening of quiet waiting. The room has received you back into its quiet embrace, and the door has closed behind you, with a soft click that seems to sever the connection between the inside and the outside. The grey light of the afternoon has followed you through the window, and now pools on the floorboards and the tabletop and the iron bed frame in patterns that you know as well as you know the lines on your own palms. You have removed your coat and hung it on the peg beside the door where it hangs with the patient slump of a garment that expects to remain undisturbed for many hours. Your boots stand side by side near the foot of the bed, with their toes pointing slightly inward, and their laces loosened and trailing on the boards. The room smells of the tea leaves you steeped this morning, and the faint mustiness of old wool, and the particular dry scent of plaster that has been slowly turning to dust for 100 years. You cross to the window, and you do not sit at first. Instead you stand with your shoulder against the frame, and you look out at the street below with the same attention that you might give to a painting that hangs in a familiar hallway. But glass is cool against your forehead when you lean close, and your breath fobs a small circle that expands and contracts with each exhalation. Through this shifting fog, you watch the street that has been your companion through so many quiet hours, and you note the small changes that have occurred since you last looked out this morning. The cars and the horse have gone from their station near the corner, and the driver has taken his newspaper to some other waiting place. The women who stood talking near the lamppost have finished their conversation and dispersed to their separate doorways. The street is emptier now than it was, but not entirely empty, and the figures who remain move with the slow, deliberate pace of people who have nowhere urgent to be. You settle into the chair that faces the window. The chair accepts your weight with a familiar creak, and the wooden seat presses against your thighs in the same spots that it always presses. You shift slightly to the left and then back to the right until you find the position that distributes your weight most evenly, and then you let your body relax into this arrangement. Your hands rest in your lap with the fingers loosely interlaced, and your shoulders drop away from your ears, and your breathing slows to match the rhythm of the street outside. This is the posture of watching, and you have practiced it so many times that it comes to you without any conscious direction. The window frames a section of the street that measures perhaps 20 feet from one edge of the glass to the other. On the left side of the frame stands the corner of the lodging house itself, with its dark brick and its drain pipe that rattles faintly when the wind blows from the east. On the right side the view extends to the iron railing of the house opposite and the 3 stone steps that lead up to its blue-painted door. Between these boundaries lies the cobbled surface of the lane and the narrow pavement that runs along each side. The pavement is made of flat stones that have been worn into shallow depressions by the passage of countless feet, and these depressions collect small puddles when it rains and small drifts of dust when it is dry. Today the pavement is merely damp, and the stones gleam with a dull sheen that reflects the grey sky above. You watch the street, and you wait for the first event of the afternoon. The waiting is not impatient because you know that something will happen eventually, and until it does you have the window and the chair and the quiet of the room to occupy you. You study the blue-painted door across the way, and you note that a fresh scratch has appeared in the paint near the handle. The scratch is pale against the dark blue, and it forms a shape like a crescent moon laid on its side. You wonder what caused it, and you will never know, and this small mystery sits comfortably in your mind alongside all the other small mysteries that you have collected during your hours at the window. A sound reaches you from somewhere to the left beyond the edge of the frame. It is a sound that you have learned to recognize over many afternoons of listening. The slow, deliberate clop of a horse's hooves on cobblestones and the accompanying rumble of iron-rimmed wheels. You do not lean forward or crane your neck because you know that the source of the sound will appear in the frame in its own time. You simply wait and listen as the sounds grow louder and more distinct. The horse's hooves make a 4-beat rhythm that varies slightly with each step as the animal adjusts its footing on the uneven stones. The cart wheels produce a lower continuous rumble that rises and falls as they roll over the gaps between the cobbles. A third sound joins the others, a high thin squeak that repeats at regular intervals and that you identify as the left front wheel of the coal cart. The coal cart enters the frame from the left and moves across your field of view with a stately slowness that allows you to observe every detail. The horse is a heavy bay with a white blaze on its forehead and feathered fetlocks that are dark with mud. It walks with its head low and its ears relaxed, and its breath forms small clouds of vapor that drift backward and dissipate. The cart itself is a sturdy wooden vehicle painted a faded green and piled high with sacks of coal that bulge and sag against one another. The driver sits on a plank seat at the front with the reins held loosely in one hand and his other hand resting on his knee. He wears a flat cap pulled low and a heavy coat with a collar turned up against the damp. His face is weathered and his eyes are fixed on the street ahead, with the unfocused gaze of someone who has traveled this route so many times that he no longer needs to see it. The squeaking wheel turns and squeaks and turns again, and the sound fades as the cart passes out of the right side of the frame and continues on its way to whatever destination awaits it. The street returns to stillness. The sound of the coal cart lingers for a few moments after the cart itself has disappeared, and then it too fades, and the only noises are the distant murmur of the city and the soft creak of the lodging house settling around you. You shift your weight slightly, and the chair creaks in response. Your eyes remain on the empty street, and you notice that a small piece of straw has fallen from the coal cart and now lies across 2 cobblestones near the center of the lane. The straw is pale yellow against the dark grey of the stones, and it catches what little light there is. You watch the straw and you wonder how long it will remain there before a gust of wind carries it away, or a passing foot grinds it into the mud. You have no way to know, and you will likely not be watching when it finally disappears, but the wandering itself is a small occupation that fills a small space of time. The blue door across the way opens and a figure emerges. It is a woman in a brown dress and a white apron, and she carries a woven basket over one arm. She pauses on the top step to adjust her shawl, which has slipped from one shoulder, and then she descends the 3 steps with care, placing each foot precisely on the center of each tread. When she reaches the pavement, she turns left and walks out of the frame, and you listen to her footsteps recede until they merge with the general background of the city. The door remains closed behind her, and the blue paint continues to peel in small curls near the upper hinge. You note this detail, and you file it away with the scratch shaped like a crescent moon. The afternoon light shifts by a degree that is almost imperceptible. The grey has taken on a slightly warmer tone as the sun somewhere above the clouds moves toward the western horizon. The shadows beneath the window ledge have lengthened by the width of your thumb, and the damp cobblestones have begun to dry in patches where the air circulates most freely. You watch these changes without counting them, because counting would require an effort that you prefer not to make. Instead, you simply observe and let the observations accumulate, like the dust on the tabletop and the lint in the dented floorboard. A new sound announces itself from the direction of the main thoroughfare. This sound is human rather than mechanical, and it consists of a voice raised in a repetitive cry that you cannot quite decipher. The words are stretched and distorted by the distance and by the echoes that bounce between the brick walls of the lane. You listen as the cry grows louder and more distinct, and you begin to pick out the shape of the words. Old clothes, old iron, any old rags, old clothes, old iron. The voice belongs to a costermonger or a rag-and-bone man making his rounds through the district, and his cry is as regular and predictable as the squeaking wheel of the coal cart. The rag-and-bone man enters the frame from the right, walking slowly with a large wicker basket strapped to his back. The basket rises above his shoulders and sways slightly with each step, and you can see the handles of various tools protruding from its top, a bent fire iron and a copper pot with a hole in its bottom, and a bundle of fabric tied with string. The man himself is thin and stooped, and he wears a long coat that has been patched so many times that the original fabric is almost entirely hidden. He carries a wooden stick in one hand, and he uses it to probe at the gutters and the doorways as he passes, examining whatever refuse has accumulated there. His cry continues at regular intervals, and the words blend together into a kind of song that has no melody but still contains a rhythm. Old, close old iron and old rags. He passes across the frame and disappears to the left, and his voice fades by degrees, until it is swallowed by the distance. The street is empty again. The straw from the coal cart has not moved, and it lies across the cobblestones in the same position. You look at the straw, and then you look at the blue door, and then you look at the iron railing opposite. The railing has 7 vertical bars and 2 horizontal rails, and the paint is flaking in the same pattern that you have observed on every other iron surface in this district. One of the vertical bars is slightly bent near the top, where something heavy must have struck it long ago. The bend creates a small gap between that bar and its neighbor, and through this gap you can see a portion of the stone step behind. The stone is grey with darker grey flecks, and a thin crack runs diagonally from the upper left corner to the middle of the right edge. You study the crack, and you trace its path with your eyes, and you note the small accumulation of moss that grows in the crevice where the crack widens near the bottom. A child appears in the frame, walking from left to right. The child is perhaps 7 or 8 years old, and wears a coat that is too large and a pair of clogs that are also too large and that make a hollow clopping sound on the cobblestones. The child's face is smudged with dirt, and the hair is a tangled mass that has not seen a comb in some days. The child walks with a peculiar gait that involves kicking at something on the ground ahead, and you lean forward slightly to see what it is. A small stone, perhaps the size of a walnut, is being propelled along the lane by the toe of the child's clog. The stone skitters and bounces and rolls, and the child follows it with a single-minded focus that excludes everything else. When the stone comes to rest, the child kicks it again and resumes walking. This process repeats 5 or 6 times as the child crosses the frame, and then the stone rolls into the gap between 2 cobblestones and sticks there. The child stops and bends down and pries the stone loose with small dirty fingers, and then straightens up and kicks it again. The child and the stone pass out of the frame to the right, and the hollow clopping of the clogs fades into silence. You watch the spot where the child disappeared, and you wait to see if anything else will happen. The street remains empty for a long stretch of time, during which you observe the slow drift of a single cloud across the patch of sky visible at the top of the window frame. The cloud is a pale grey shape with indistinct edges, and it moves from left to right with a stately progress that you can only detect by looking away and then looking back. When you look away, you study the watermark on the ceiling, which has not changed since this morning, and the knot in the floorboard, which also has not changed. When you look back, the cloud has moved by the width of your hand, and its shape has altered slightly, with one edge becoming thinner and more diffuse. You watch the cloud until it passes out of the frame entirely, and then you return your gaze to the street. The sound of the costermonger's cry has faded completely and been replaced by a new sound that comes from the opposite direction. This sound is a rhythmic scraping that you associate with the sharpening of knives. It is produced by a grinding wheel being turned against a blade, and it rises and falls in a regular cycle. The sound grows louder, and a man enters the frame pushing a small cart that carries a treadle-operated grinding wheel. The man is old, and his back is bent from years of leaning over his work. He stops near the blue door and sets the brake on his cart, and then he stands waiting with his hands clasped behind his back. After a short interval, the blue door opens and the woman with the basket emerges and hands him a pair of scissors and a kitchen knife. The man takes the items and seats himself on the cart and begins to work the treadle with his foot. The wheel spins, and the man applies the blade of the knife to its surface, and the scraping sound fills the lane. Sparks fly from the contact point in a small shower of orange that fades to grey before it reaches the ground. The woman watches for a moment and then returns inside and closes the door. The man continues his work and the scraping sound continues, and you watch the slow, careful movements of his hands as he tests the edge of the knife with his thumb and returns it to the wheel. The knife sharpener finishes his work and holds the blade up to the light, examining it with a critical eye. He nods to himself and sets the knife aside and takes up the scissors. The scissors require a different technique, and he opens and closes them against the wheel with a series of short, precise movements. When he is satisfied, he wipes both items with a rag and carries them to the blue door. He knocks and the woman appears and takes the items and hands him a small coin which he pockets without looking at it. He returns to his cart and releases the brake and pushes it out of the frame to the left. The scraping sound fades and the street is quiet again. The light has continued its slow decline, and the grey has deepened to a shade that makes the shadows under the eaves seem almost blue. The straw from the coal cart remains in its place on the cobblestones, and you can see it clearly despite the fading light, because its pale colour stands out against the dark stone. You have been sitting at the window for a length of time that you cannot measure, but your body tells you that the afternoon is drawing toward evening. Your legs have grown stiff, and your back has developed a small ache between the shoulder blades. You shift in the chair and the ache subsides and then returns, and you accept it as a familiar companion. The street is preparing for the night in its own quiet way. A man passes carrying a long pole with a small flame at its tip, and he pauses at each gas lamp along the lane. He reaches up with the pole and touches the flame to the fixture, and a soft pop sounds as the gas ignites and a pale yellow glow blossoms behind the glass. He moves from lamp to lamp, and the pools of light spread along the street in his wake. When he reaches the lamp near the blue door, he performs the same ritual, and the light falls across the iron railing and the stone steps and the closed door. He continues out of the frame, and the lamps behind him burn steadily with a faint hiss that you cannot hear through the glass, but that you can imagine clearly. You watch the lamplight play across the cobblestones, and you notice that the straw has finally moved. A small breath of wind must have found its way down the lane, because the straw now lies at a different angle, with one end lifted slightly off the stone. You watch it for a while longer, and you see it shift again by a fraction of an inch. The movement is so small that you might have imagined it, that you continue to watch, and the straw continues its slow journey across the cobblestones, propelled by currents of air that you cannot feel. It moves toward the edge of the frame, and you follow it with your eyes until it passes out of sight, and you are left with the empty street and the gas lamps and the blue door. The room behind you has grown dark while you watched the street. The grey light that pooled on the floorboards has retreated entirely, and the corners of the room are filled with soft shadow. You rise from the chair, and your body protests with a series of small creaks and pops. You cross to the table and find the candle stub and the matches that you keep beside the enamel cup. You strike a match, and the flame flares briefly and then settles into a steady glow that you touch to the wick. The candle catches, and the room fills with a warm orange light that pushes the shadows back toward the walls. You carry the candle to the window and set it on the sill, and the flame reflects in the glass, creating a small duplicate of itself that seems to float in the dark street beyond. You stand for a moment looking at the two flames, the real one and the reflection, and then you turn away and let the evening settle around you like a blanket that has been waiting all day to be pulled up to your chin. The evening has settled fully over the city, and the gas lamps have been burning long enough that their glow has become a fixed part of the streetscape rather than a new arrival. You have left your room again because the walls have grown too familiar, and the candle stub had burned down to a pool of wax that no longer held a flame. The door closed behind you with its soft click, and the stairs received your footsteps one after another until you reached the street where the air was colder than you remembered and carried the smell of coal smoke and damp stone, and something else that you could not identify, but which spoke of evening meals being prepared in kitchens you would never see. Your coat is buttoned to your throat, and your hands are in your pockets, and your breath forms small clouds that appear and vanish with each exhalation. The streets you walk are not the streets of your morning stroll. You have turned away from the canal and the mill, and you are moving deeper into the warren of narrow lanes that lie behind the main thoroughfares. The buildings here are older and closer together, and their upper stories lean outward over the pavement so that the strip of sky visible above is reduced to a pale grey ribbon, no wider than your outstretched arms. The gas lamps are fewer in this quarter, and the spaces between them are filled with a darkness that seems to have texture and weight. Your footsteps echo in these dark spaces and then emerge into the next pool of light, and then fade again into the next stretch of shadow. The rhythm of light and dark and light and dark becomes a kind of walking meditation that requires no thought. You are not walking without purpose, even though you have not named the purpose to yourself. Your feet know where they are going because they have walked this route before on other evenings, when the room grew too small and the hunger that is always present grew sharp enough to notice. The destination is a basement hall that lies beneath a chapel on a side street, where the cobblestones are so worn that they have become smooth and slippery like river stones. The chapel itself is a plain building of grey stone with a small spire that rises no higher than the surrounding rooftops. Its windows are dark and its door is closed, but a faint light spills from a grating at ground level, and this light is what draws you and the others who are converging on the same point from different directions. You reach the top of a short flight of stone steps that descends from the pavement to a door set below the level of the street. The steps are worn in the center, like the steps of the relief office, and they glisten with damp in the light that escapes from the crack beneath the door. You descend, carefully placing your feet at the edges where the stone is less polished, and you push the door open and step inside. The warmth of the basement hall wraps around you immediately, and it is so different from the cold of the street that you pause for a moment just inside the threshold to let the sensation settle over you. The warmth is not a dry warmth, but a moist warmth that carries the smell of boiling vegetables and wet wool and many bodies gathered in a confined space. The hall is a long, low room with a ceiling of whitewashed brick that arches gently overhead. The whitewash has yellowed with age and steam, and it is streaked with vertical lines of condensation that run down the walls and collect in small puddles on the stone floor. The puddles reflect the light of the oil lamps that hang from iron brackets at intervals along the walls, and the reflections tremble faintly as people move past them. At the far end of the hall, a long trestle table has been set up, and behind it stand two women and a man who are tending to a collection of large iron pots. The pots sit on small coal stoves, and steam rises from their open tops in thick white columns that spread out against the ceiling and add to the general moisture of the air. The steam carries the smell of the broth within, and the smell is simple and plain and deeply comforting. Between you and the table stand perhaps 30 or 40 people arranged in a loose queue that stretches back toward the door. The queue moves slowly as each person reaches the table and receives a bowl and a piece of bread, and then moves aside to find a place along the walls where they can eat. The people are of all ages and both sexes, and they wear the same kinds of clothes that you have seen on every other person in this district. Coats that are too large or too small, and scarves that are thin and frayed, and boots that have been resoled many times. Their faces are grey in the lamplight, and their eyes are fixed on the table ahead with a patient attention that you recognize from the queue at the relief office and the waiting at the mill gates. You take your place at the end of the line and you settle into the familiar posture of waiting. The queue moves forward by small increments as each person at the front receives their portion and steps away. The sound of the hall is a low murmur composed of many elements that blend into a single texture. The hiss of the steam from the pots, and the soft shuffle of feet on the stone floor, and the quiet murmur of voices speaking in tones that are too low to distinguish individual words. Above these sounds rises the regular repetition of the ladle against the bowls, a soft clink of metal on earthenware that occurs every 10 or 15 seconds with a perfect regularity. The woman who holds the ladle dips it into the pot and raises it full of pale broth and pours it into the waiting bowl. The person receiving the bowl murmurs something and moves away, and the next person steps forward, and the ladle dips and rises and pours again. The rhythm is as steady as the squeaking wheel of the coal cart, and it fills the hall with a sense of order and predictability. You watch the people ahead of you as they receive their bowls and find their places against the walls. An old man with a white beard takes his bowl in both hands and carries it carefully to a spot near the corner where he sits down on an upturned crate and begins to eat with slow, deliberate movements. A woman with a small child wrapped in her shawl receives 2 bowls and balances them with practiced skill as she moves to a bench where the child can sit beside her. The child's face appears from within the shawl and watches the bowl with large dark eyes, and then disappears again as the mother lifts a spoon to its lips. A younger man with a cap pulled low receives his bowl and his bread, and stands against the wall near the door eating quickly with his head bowed and his eyes on the floor. Each person finds their space and settles into it, and the hall gradually fills with the soft sounds of consumption. The queue moves forward, and you can now see the details of the table and the pots more clearly. The pots are made of black iron, and their surfaces are pitted and scarred from years of use over open fires. The broth within is a pale liquid that contains small pieces of carrot and turnip and onion, and occasional shreds of meat that are too small to identify. The bread that accompanies the broth is arranged in a pile on a wooden board, and it is a dark, heavy bread made from coarse flour that has not been fully sifted. The woman with the ladle is middle-aged with grey hair pulled back under a white cap, and her face is flushed from the heat of the pots. She does not look at the faces of the people she serves, but rather at the bowls and the ladle and the level of the broth in the pot. The man beside her hands out the bread, and his movements are equally mechanical and equally without expression. The queue moves forward again, and you are now only a few people from the front. The warmth of the pots reaches you more strongly, and you feel the heat on your face and hands. The condensation on the walls is thicker here near the source of the steam, and it runs down the whitewash in rivulets that have carved small channels in the soft surface over many months of operation. You watch a single drop of water form at the edge of a brick and hang suspended for a long moment before it falls to join the puddle on the floor. The puddle ripples and settles, and the process begins again with a new drop forming in the same place. The person ahead of you receives a bowl and steps away, and you are at the front of the queue. The woman with the ladle looks at you for the first time, and her eyes are pale blue and tired, and they hold no judgment or curiosity. She dips the ladle into the pot and raises it full and pours the broth into a bowl that she lifts from a stack beside her. The bowl is warm in your hands when you take it, and the warmth spreads through your palms and into your wrists. You step to the side, and the man hands you a thick slice of the dark bread, and you take it with your free hand. You murmur something, and the man murmurs something in return, and the words are not important, and neither of you will remember them. You turn away from the table and look for a place to stand. The walls are lined with people eating, and the benches are full, and the upturned crates are occupied. You find a space near a corner where a section of wall is free, and you lean your shoulder against the whitewashed brick. The brick is warm from the steam, and the warmth seeps through your coat and into your back. You hold the bowl in both hands, and you raise it to your lips, and you take the first sip. The broth is thin and hot, and it tastes of the vegetables that have been boiled in it for many hours. The carrots have given up their sweetness, and the turnips have given up their earthiness, and the onions have dissolved into the liquid, leaving only their essence behind. There is a faint saltiness and a hint of something that might be pepper, and underneath it all the deep savory taste of the meat that has been stretched to feed as many as possible. The warmth travels down your throat and settles in your stomach and spreads outward through your chest and into your limbs. You take another sip and then another, and you feel the cold of the street receding from your body like a tide going out. The bread is dense and chewy, and it requires effort to tear with your teeth. You dip a corner of it into the broth and hold it there until it softens, and then you eat it slowly. The bread absorbs the liquid and becomes a warm, soft mass that fills your mouth with a combined taste of grain and broth. You chew and swallow and take another sip, and the process repeats itself with a rhythm that matches the rhythm of the ladle against the bowls and the drip of the condensation on the walls. Around you, the other people are engaged in the same quiet ritual, and the hall is filled with the soft sounds of eating and the occasional clink of a spoon against a bowl. You let your gaze wander around the hall while you eat. The lamplight casts long shadows that stretch up the walls and across the ceiling, and the shadows move slightly as the flames flicker in the draughts that find their way through the door. The faces of the other diners are illuminated in profile and three-quarter view, and they appear softer and younger in the warm light than they do in the grey of the street. A woman near the table has closed her eyes as she eats, and her lips move silently in what might be a prayer or might be simply the act of savouring. An old man has finished his broth and is using a finger to wipe the inside of the bowl, collecting the last traces of liquid and bringing them to his mouth. A young boy has fallen asleep against his mother's shoulder, with a half-eaten piece of bread still clutched in his small hand. The mother does not wake him, but simply shifts her weight to support him more comfortably and continues eating her own portion. The steam from the pots continues to rise and spread across the ceiling, and it forms a thin cloud that hangs just below the whitewashed bricks. The cloud shifts and swirls as new steam rises to join it, and it takes on shapes that are briefly recognizable and then dissolve. You watch a shape that resembles a bird with outstretched wings, and then it is gone, and another shape appears that might be a tree or a column of smoke from a distant chimney. The watching requires no effort, and the shapes require no interpretation. They simply appear and disappear, and you observe them with the same detached attention that you give to the clouds in the sky and the shadows on the floorboards of your room. Your bowl is nearly empty now. You tilt it towards you and drink the last of the broth, and you feel the small solid pieces of vegetable slide against your lips and into your mouth. You chew them slowly and swallow, and then you set the bowl down on the floor beside your feet. The bread is finished as well, except for a small crust that you have saved for last, and you eat it now with the same careful attention that you gave to the first bite. The crust is harder than the rest, and it scrapes against the roof of your mouth as you chew. You swallow, and the meal is complete. The warmth of the food has spread throughout your body, and you feel a heaviness in your limbs that is pleasant and soothing. The hall seems quieter now than it did when you arrived, or perhaps your ears have simply grown accustomed to the sounds. The queue at the table has shortened, and the women behind the pots are beginning to scrape the bottoms with their ladles, collecting the last portions for the final few people. The man with the bread has only a few slices left on his board, and he hands them out one by one with the same mechanical gesture. The steam has lessened as the pots empty, and the cloud on the ceiling has begun to thin and disperse. You remain against the wall for a while longer because there is no reason to hurry back into the cold. The warmth of the hall is a gift that you accept without question, and you let it settle into your bones for as long as it chooses to stay. Beside you, a woman finishes her bowl and sets it down and wipes her mouth with the back of her hand. She catches your eye for a moment and gives a small nod that acknowledges your shared presence in this warm room on this cold evening. You nod in return, and then she looks away, and you look away, and the moment passes. The people around you are beginning to leave. They rise from the benches and the crates, and they carry their empty bowls to a tub of water that stands near the door. They dip the bowls in the water and swish them around and set them on a wooden rack to dry, and then they climb the stone steps and disappear into the street. The door opens and closes, and each time it opens a gust of cold air sweeps into the hall and makes the lamplight flicker. The warmth retreats slightly, and then returns as the door closes again. You watch this cycle repeat several times, and you know that soon it will be your turn to rise and carry your bowl to the tub and climb the steps into the night. You pick up your empty bowl from the floor, and you walk to the tub near the door. The water in the tub is grey and lukewarm, and it contains small fragments of bread and vegetable that float on the surface. You dip the bowl and swirl it, and the water clouds further as the last traces of broth dissolve. You set the bowl on the rack where it joins a dozen others, all turned upside down to drain. You dry your hands on your coat, and you look back once at the hall, and the table, and the pots, and the women who are now covering the pots with heavy lids. They do not look at you, and you do not expect them to. You turn and climb the stone steps, and push the door open and step out into the street. The cold wraps around you immediately, and it is sharper than you remembered because the warmth of the hall is still in your blood. Your breath forms clouds again, and the clouds are thicker and whiter than they were before. The gas lamps are still burning, and their light falls on the cobblestones and the brick walls and the closed doors of the surrounding buildings. You begin to walk, and your footsteps echo in the narrow lane, and the sound follows you as you make your way back toward the lodging house. The route is familiar, and your feet find it without guidance. The streets are quieter now than they were when you walked to the hall. The costermongers have gone home, and the knife sharpeners have gone home, and the children with their kicking stones have gone inside to whatever rooms they occupy. The only people you pass are other figures, walking alone with their hands in their pockets and their heads bowed against the cold. They do not look at you, and you do not look at them. You are all moving through the same night toward the same kind of rest, and there is nothing that needs to be said. The lodging house appears at the end of the lane, and its dark bulk is familiar and comforting. You climb the steps and push the door and enter the narrow hallway, where the single gas jet burns with a low flame. The stairs creak under your weight as you climb, and the sound is the same sound they made this morning and will make tomorrow. You reach your door and open it and step inside and close it behind you. The room is dark and cold, and the candle stub on the windowsill has hardened into a white pool. You do not light it again because the darkness is enough, and because your body is heavy with the warmth of the broth and the bread. You remove your coat and your boots, and you lie down on the bed and pull the blanket up to your chin. The ceiling is invisible above you, and the watermark is invisible, and the crack in the wall is invisible. They are all still there, waiting for the morning light to reveal them again. You close your eyes, and the sounds of the lodging house settle around you like the steam on the ceiling of the hall, and you let them carry you into the long, slow drift towards sleep. The morning arrives without the assistance of a factory whistle, because this is a Sunday, or perhaps because the mill remains silent, as it has remained silent for so many weeks that the distinction between workdays and rest days has blurred into a single continuous grey. You wake not to a sound, but to a change in the quality of the darkness behind your closed eyelids. The darkness has become slightly less dark, as if someone has added a small amount of milk to a cup of black tea. You open your eyes and the ceiling is visible above you with its watermark and its faint swirls of plaster and its patient stillness. You lie without moving because movement would require a decision, and decisions require a reason, and no reason presents itself. The first measure of the day is not a number on a dial, but a sensation in your body. Your stomach is empty, but not yet complaining. It has learned over the past months to wait quietly for whatever might come, and it no longer sends urgent signals at the hour when breakfast would once have appeared. You recognize this state as the early morning state, and you know that it will persist for some time before shifting into the late morning state when the emptiness becomes more noticeable. This knowledge is not precise, but it is reliable, and it serves the same purpose that a clock might serve if you possessed one. You turn your head on the pillow and look toward the window. The grey light that seeps through the glass has a particular quality at this hour that you have learned to identify. It is thin and watery, and it casts no distinct shadows on the floorboards. Later, the light will thicken and warm slightly, and the shadow of the window frame will appear on the wall opposite and begin its slow journey downward. But that is later, and this is now, and the light tells you that the morning is still young. You close your eyes again and let your breathing slow, and you drift in the space between sleeping and waking, where time does not exist at all. When you open your eyes again, the light has changed. The shadow of the window frame has appeared on the wall, and it has travelled perhaps the width of your hand downward from the ceiling. This movement marks the passage of an interval that you cannot name in minutes, but that you recognize as the time it takes for the sun behind the clouds to climb a certain distance above the rooftops. The shadow will continue its descent throughout the morning, and by the time it reaches the floorboards, the morning will be over and the afternoon will have begun. You have watched this progression so many times that you could draw the path of the shadow on the wall from memory, and you have considered doing so with the stub of pencil in your pocket. But you have never actually done it because the watching itself is enough. You sit up and place your feet on the cold boards. The cold is a different kind of measurement. In the deepest part of the night, the boards are so cold that they seem to draw the warmth directly from your bones. In the early morning they are cold, but not bitterly so, and by midday they will have warmed slightly from the heat of your body moving across them and from the weak sun that sometimes breaks through the clouds. You sit on the edge of the bed, and you do not stand immediately because standing requires effort, and effort should be distributed evenly across the hours that stretch ahead. You listen to the sounds of the lodging house, and you use them to confirm what the light and the shadow have already told you. Mr. Harrow in the room above is not moving yet. His floorboards are silent, and this silence tells you that it is still early because Mr. Harrow rises at a particular point in the morning that you have come to recognize. When his first footsteps sound, you will know that another interval has passed. The dripping tap in the washroom is dripping with the same rhythm it always drips, and this tells you nothing about the time, but it provides a steady background against which other sounds can be measured. The street outside is quiet, with the particular quiet of early morning when even the coal carts have not yet begun their rounds. You listen, and you wait, and you feel the shape of the day beginning to form around you. Your stomach sends a small signal, and you note it without responding. The signal is a faint hollow sensation that is not yet hunger, but is the precursor to hunger. You know from experience that this sensation will grow gradually over the next span of time, and that by the time the shadow reaches the midpoint of the wall, it will have become a definite need rather than a vague suggestion. You have a small piece of bread remaining from yesterday wrapped in a cloth inside the tin on the table. You could eat it now, but if you eat it now, you will not have it later, and the later hunger will be sharper than the present hunger. This calculation is simple, and you perform it without conscious thought, and you decide to wait. You rise from the bed and cross to the window. The glass is cool against your fingertips when you touch it, and the coolness is another measure. On cold mornings, the glass is cold enough to numb your skin, and on milder mornings it is merely cool. This morning it is cool, but not cold, and this tells you that the temperature outside is moderate for the season. You look out at the street, and you see that the gas lamp on the corner has been extinguished. The lamplighter makes his rounds at a particular hour, and the dark lamp tells you that this hour has passed. The street is empty except for a single cat that walks along the top of the iron railing with a slow, deliberate gait. The cat stops and sits and licks one paw and then continues. You watch the cat until it disappears around the corner, and then you turn away from the window. The room offers several other measures of time if you choose to consult them. The pile of mended clothing on the chair has grown slightly over the past days, and each new addition marks a span of hours spent with needle and thread. The candle stub on the windowsill has diminished by a small amount since last evening, and the pool of hardened wax has spread a little farther across the wood. The dust on the tabletop has accumulated in a thin film that you can see when the light strikes it at the correct angle. You could wipe the dust away with your sleeve, and the clean patch would mark this moment as distinct from the moments before and after. But you do not wipe it because the dust is a record of stillness, and stillness is what this day requires. You return to the bed and sit down again. Your hand goes to your coat, which hangs on the peg beside the door, and you reach into the pocket and withdraw a small collection of objects. These objects are your companions through the long hours, and you know each of them by touch and by weight and by the particular way they fit into your palm. You spread them on the blanket beside you, and you look at them one by one. There is a piece of string approximately the length of your forearm from wrist to elbow. The string is made of hemp, and it has been used for something before it came to you because one end is frayed and the other end has a small knot tied in it. You pick up the string and run it through your fingers, and you wonder what it once held together. A parcel perhaps, or a bundle of kindling, or a sack of flour. The wondering fills a small space of time, and when you set the string down, the light on the wall has moved by a fraction. The next object is a smooth button made of dark wood with 4 small holes drilled through its center. The button is round and flat, and it has a pleasant weight in your palm. You turn it over and you examine the grain of the wood, which swirls in patterns that resemble the watermark on the ceiling. The button came from a coat that you no longer possess, and you cannot remember when you removed it or why you kept it. You keep it now because it is smooth and because it fits into the curve of your thumb, and because it is something to hold when your hands are empty. You rub your thumb across its surface and you feel the faint ridges of the grain and the small scratch near one of the holes where a needle once slipped. The button asks nothing of you, and you ask nothing of it. The third object is a stub of pencil no longer than your little finger. The wood is painted a faded blue, and the lead is worn down to a flat angle from use. You have used this pencil to make small marks on scraps of paper that you later use to light the spirit stove. You have written nothing of importance with it because nothing of importance has occurred that required recording. The pencil is a tool without a task, and it waits in your pocket for a task that may never arrive. You test the lead against your thumbnail, and it leaves a faint grey mark that you rub away with your thumb. The fourth object is a small square of folded paper that has been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases are soft and beginning to tear. You unfold the paper carefully because it is old and fragile, and you do not want it to separate into pieces. Inside, there is nothing written, but the paper itself holds the memory of whatever was once written upon it. You hold the paper up to the light, and you can see faint indentations where a pen pressed into the surface. The indentations form letters that you cannot quite decipher, and you have spent many hours trying to read them without success. The paper is a mystery that will never be solved, and this is comforting because a solved mystery would leave you with nothing to ponder. You return the objects to your pocket one by one, the paper folded along its creases and the pencil tucked beside it, and the button placed carefully so it will not roll away, and a string coiled into a small loop. The pocket holds these things against your thigh, and you feel their presence as a small, solid reassurance. The inventory of your pocket has occupied a span of time that you could measure by the movement of the shadow on the wall. The shadow has traveled downward by perhaps the width of 2 fingers since you sat down. The morning is progressing, and your stomach has sent another signal slightly stronger than the last. You decide to make a cup of tea. This decision is not urgent, but it provides a structure for the next interval of time. You rise and take the enamel cup from the table and carry it to the washroom where the tap drips its endless rhythm. You fill the cup halfway and return to your room and set it on the spirit stove. The methylated spirits in the reservoir are low, and you make a mental note that you will need to visit the chandler's shop tomorrow or the next day. The note is not written down because you will remember it. You strike a match and touch it to the wick, and the blue flame appears and wraps around the base of the cup. You sit on the edge of the bed and watch the water begin its slow journey toward boiling. The sound of the flame is a steady hiss that joins the dripping tap and the distant murmur of the city. You watch the surface of the water, and you wait for the first small bubbles to appear. They always appear first along the bottom edge of the cup, where the metal is hottest, and they cling there for a time before detaching and rising. The interval between lighting the stove and the appearance of the first bubbles is a measure that you know well. It is the time it takes to think about nothing in particular, or to count the swirls in the plaster ceiling, or to listen to Mr. Harrow's first footsteps which have just sounded overhead. The footsteps cross the room above, and pause, and then cross back, and then there is the sound of water being poured from a pitcher. Mr. Harrow is making his own morning preparations, and his sounds mark the time as reliably as any clock. The first bubbles appear at the bottom of the cup, and you watch them grow and detach and rise. The water begins to shiver, and more bubbles form, and the surface trembles. When the water reaches a proper boil, you remove the cup with the folded rag and set it on the table. You measure a pinch of tea leaves from the tin and drop them into the hot water, and you watch the brown color spread. The steeping of the tea occupies another interval during which you stand at the window and look out at the street. The street has changed since you last looked. The cat is gone, and in its place a man walks slowly along the pavement with a dog at his heels. The dog is small and brown, and it stops frequently to investigate smells that are invisible to you. The man waits each time the dog stops, and then they continue together. The coal cart has made its appearance and disappeared, and the squeaking wheel has faded into the distance. The rag-and-bone man has not yet appeared, but he will appear at his usual hour, and his cry will mark the transition from morning to midday. You lift the cup and take a sip of the tea. It is weak and warm, and it fills your mouth with a familiar bitterness. You hold the cup in both hands, and you feel the heat transfer into your palms, and you watch the street and you wait for nothing in particular. The tea is finished, and you set the empty cup on the table. The shadow on the wall has reached the line where the plaster meets the floorboards. The morning is over, and the afternoon has begun. Your stomach has progressed from a hollow sensation to a definite ache, and you decide that it is time to eat the piece of bread. You unwrap it from the cloth, and you hold it in your hands. The bread is dry and dense, and it requires effort to chew. You eat it slowly, taking small bites, and letting each bite soften in your mouth before you swallow. The eating occupies a span of time that you do not measure, but that you feel as a small satisfaction. The afternoon stretches ahead of you, and you consider how you will fill it. The shadow will continue its journey across the floorboards, and the light will shift from grey to a warmer grey, and then back to the cool grey of evening. You could walk to the canal and watch the water and the barges and the men who stand by the mill gates. You could walk to the library and sit in the warm, dusty room with a heavy book open on your lap. You could remain here in the room and watch the street and listen to the sounds of the house and let the hours pass in the quiet way that they always pass. The decision does not require immediate resolution, and you allow it to rest in your mind while you sit on the bed and listen to the dripping tap and the creaking floorboards and the distant church bells that have begun to ring somewhere in the city. The church bells are a measure of time that you cannot ignore. They ring at particular hours, and their sound travels across the rooftops and through the fog and reaches you in your room. The bells are ringing now for the midday service, or perhaps for a wedding or a funeral. The sound is faint and melodious, and it rises and falls in patterns that you do not understand. You listen to the bells and you count the strikes without meaning to. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8. The counting tells you nothing because you do not know what hour the bells are marking. The bells ring for a while longer and then they fall silent, and the silence that follows is deeper than the silence that came before. You reach into your pocket and your fingers find the small collection of objects. You withdraw the string and the button and the pencil stub and the folded paper and you arrange them on the blanket again. The arrangement is different this time because you place them in a line from largest to smallest. The string is the longest and the pencil is next, and the button is smaller and the folded paper is the smallest. You look at the line of objects and you consider rearranging them by color or by weight or by the order in which you acquired them. You do not rearrange them because the first arrangement is satisfactory and because the act of arranging has already served its purpose. The afternoon light has begun to change in the way that signals the approach of evening. The grey has deepened and the shadows have softened, and the details of the room are becoming harder to distinguish. You have spent the hours since the bread in a state that is neither sleeping nor waking, but something between the two. Your body has been still on the bed, and your mind has wandered through memories and images that have no connection to one another. You remember a field that you saw once from a train window, and you remember the taste of an apple that you ate many years ago, and you remember the face of a person whose name you have forgotten. The memories drift through you and fade, and new memories take their place, and the afternoon passes in this way. The church bells ring again, and this time they ring for a longer interval. The sound is the same faint melodious pattern, and you listen without counting. When the bells fall silent, the room is noticeably darker than it was before. The shadow has disappeared from the floorboards because there is no longer enough light to cast a distinct shadow. The grey has become the grey of early evening, and the street outside is preparing for the lighting of the lamps. You rise from the bed, and your body is stiff from the long stillness. You walk to the window, and you look out at the street where the lamplighter is making his rounds. His pole reaches up, and the flame touches the fixture, and the soft yellow glow appears. The lamps light one by one, and the pools of light spread along the lane. You stand at the window, and you watch the evening settle over the street. The day has passed without a clock, and without a schedule, and without any event that could be called significant. You have measured its passage by the shadow on the wall, and the signals from your stomach, and the dripping of the tap, and the footsteps overhead, and the ringing of the distant bells. These measures are imprecise, but they are sufficient, because precision is not required. The day has been long and quiet, and it has carried you from the thin grey light of morning to the soft yellow glow of evening, without requiring anything from you except your presence. You turn away from the window and you sit on the bed, and you wait for the night to complete its slow arrival. The afternoon has reached that point where the grey light begins to feel heavy rather than merely dim, and the streets have grown quieter as people retreat indoors to wait out the hours until evening. You have walked from your room along a route that took you past the shuttered baker's shop and the silent mill and the canal, where the water lay still and dark, like a sheet of old iron. Your feet knew the way without guidance, and they have brought you to a street that is slightly wider than the lanes around it, and lined with buildings that are older and more substantial than the lodging houses and workshops of the district. One of these buildings stands out from its neighbours by virtue of a stone lintel carved with words that have been worn smooth by a century of weather, but which you know by heart because you have read them many times before. The words are Free Library, and beneath them a smaller line that reads, Established by subscription for the use of the public. The door to the library is made of dark wood, and it is heavy, and it swings inward with a slow, deliberate motion when you push against it. The sound it makes is not a creak or a groan, but a soft whoosh of air being displaced and a faint thud as it meets the frame again behind you. You step into a small vestibule where the floor is laid with black and white tiles arranged in a diamond pattern. The tiles are chipped in places, and the grout between them has darkened with the dirt of countless boots, but the pattern remains clear and orderly. A second door stands before you, and this one has a pane of frosted glass set into its upper half. Through the glass you can see the warm yellow glow of the reading room beyond, and the indistinct shapes of people sitting very still. You push this door open, and you enter the library proper. The first thing you notice is the quiet. The quiet of the library is different from the quiet of your room, or the quiet of the canal towpath. It is a quiet that has been cultivated and protected over many years, and it has a texture that you can almost feel against your skin. The sounds of the street do not penetrate here because the walls are thick and the windows are small and set high in the walls. The only sounds are those produced by the occupants themselves, and these sounds are so soft that they barely register as sounds at all. A page turns somewhere to your left with a whisper like a dry leaf sliding across stone. A chair leg scrapes faintly as someone shifts their weight. A cough is stifled behind a hand and reduced to a small muffled explosion that fades immediately. These sounds do not disturb the quiet, but rather define its boundaries. The reading room is a long rectangular space with a high ceiling supported by wooden beams that have darkened with age to the color of strong tea. The walls are lined with shelves from floor to ceiling, and the shelves are filled with books of every size and color ranged in rows that stretch away into the shadows at the far end of the room. The books have spines of leather and cloth and paper, and many of them are faded and cracked and worn at the edges. Gold lettering on some of the spines catches the light and glimmers faintly before subsiding back into the general brownness. The books give off a smell that fills the room, and that you've come to associate with this place above all others. It is the smell of old paper and dried glue and leather that has been handled by many hands over many decades. Underneath these scents there is the fainter smell of dust and the mustiness of a room that is never truly dry. In the center of the room stand several long wooden tables, with chairs arranged along both sides. The tables are scarred with the marks of use, small nicks and scratches and pale rings where cups have been set down without saucers in defiance of the rules posted on a sign near the door. The chairs are mismatched, having been donated or salvaged from various sources, and they represent a range of styles and conditions. Some have straight backs and hard seats, while others have curved backs and remnants of padding that have compressed over the years into thin, hard layers. At the far end of the room, near a small fireplace that is not lit today, sits a group of larger chairs upholstered in leather that was once dark red but has faded to a dusty brown. These chairs are the most sought-after seats in the library, and they are always occupied by the same group of regulars who arrive early and stay late. You walk across the room and your footsteps are muffled by the wide floorboards that have been softened by a century of foot traffic. The boards do not creak here as they do in the lodging house because they have been worn smooth and settled into their final positions. You find an empty chair at one of the long tables and you sit down. The chair is one of the straight-backed variety, and it accepts your weight with a small sigh that is the only sound you make. You place your hands on the table and you feel the smooth, cool surface of the wood beneath your palms. The table has been polished by the sleeves and elbows of countless readers, and it gleams faintly in the light that falls from the high windows. The windows are set just below the ceiling, and they admit a grey light that has been filtered through layers of grime on the outside and dust on the inside. The light that reaches the reading room is soft and diffuse, and it falls on the tables and the books and the bowed heads of the readers with an evenness that casts no distinct shadows. The gas lamps have been lit despite the daylight because the daylight is never quite sufficient, and their yellow glow blends with the grey from above to create a warm sepia tone that makes everything look like an old photograph. You let your eyes adjust to this light, and you look around the room at the other occupants. There are perhaps 15 people in the reading room, and they are distributed among the tables and the leather chairs, with a careful spacing that leaves at least one empty seat between each person. This spacing is not a rule, but a custom that has developed from the shared understanding that silence is easier to maintain when bodies are not too close together. The readers are mostly men of middle years or older, though there are 2 women seated near the window with a stack of periodicals between them. The men wear coats that have seen better days, and their collars are frayed and their cuffs are shiny with wear. Their faces have the same grey cast that you see everywhere in this district, and their eyes move slowly across the pages before them. One man near the fireplace has fallen asleep with a book open on his lap and his chin resting on his chest. His breathing is slow and even, and it makes a soft sound that blends with the turning of pages and the rustle of cloth. You have come to the library without a particular book in mind, because you rarely have a particular book in mind when you arrive. The choice of what to read is part of the ritual, and it occupies a span of time that might otherwise be empty. You rise from your chair and walk to the nearest shelf, and you let your eyes travel across the spines. The books are arranged in no order that you can discern, though there must be some system, because the librarian who sits at a small desk near the door occasionally rises and returns books to their proper places. The librarian is a thin man with spectacles and a grey waistcoat, and he is reading a book of his own behind the desk, and he does not look up as you browse. You appreciate this inattention because it allows you to examine the books at your leisure, without feeling observed. Your hand reaches out and touches a spine at random. The leather is dry and cool, and it has a texture like fine sandpaper. The title is stamped in gold letters that have flaked away in places, and you can read the words, "A Treatise on the Cultivation of Root Vegetables," with some difficulty. You slide the book from the shelf, and you feel its weight in your hands. It is a substantial volume bound in dark brown leather, with raised bands on the spine and pages that have yellowed to the color of weak tea. You open the cover, and the binding cracks softly, and the smell of old paper rises to meet you. The first page contains a detailed engraving of a turnip, shown in cross-section with its various parts labeled in small italic script. You turn to the next page and you find a table listing the yields of different varieties of turnip under various soil conditions. The table extends across 2 pages, and the numbers are arranged in neat columns that require no interpretation. You close the book and return it to the shelf. The turnip treatise has served its purpose, which was to provide a moment of consideration and a small weight in your hands. You move along the shelf, and your fingers trail across the spines, feeling the different textures of leather and cloth, and the raised bands and the smooth hollows where titles have been stamped. You pause at a thick volume bound in faded blue cloth with no title visible on the spine. You pull it out and examine the cover, which bears the words "Parliamentary Reports on the Condition of the Working Classes, Volume 7, in small black letters. The book is heavy, and it smells of the same dust and glue as everything else in the library. You carry it back to your chair and set it on the table with a soft thud that draws no attention from the other readers. You open the book to a random page and you begin to read. The text is set in small type, and it consists of long paragraphs that describe the testimony given before a committee many years ago. The language is formal and circuitous, and it describes conditions in factories and mines and agricultural districts that no longer exist in quite the same form. You read a sentence about the average consumption of bread per household in a particular parish, and then you read another sentence about the quality of the water obtained from a particular well. The information is specific and detailed, and it has no relevance to your life, but the act of reading it occupies your mind in a way that is restful rather than demanding. Your eyes move across the lines in the words into your consciousness and pass through it without leaving any permanent trace. After a time, you realize that you have read the same paragraph 3 times without noticing. This is not a failure of attention, but rather a feature of the library experience. The words are a medium through which the time passes, and their specific meaning is secondary to their rhythm and their presence on the page. You turn the page and you continue reading, and the light from the high window shifts by a small increment that you do not notice until you look up and see that the pattern of grey and yellow on the table has altered. The man in the leather chair near the fireplace has woken from his nap, and he is turning the pages of his book with slow, deliberate movements. His fingers are gnarled and the skin is thin and spotted, and you watch them move across the page with a kind of reverence for their patience. The quiet of the library is broken by a sound that is louder than the usual whispers and rustles. The door to the vestibule has opened, and a new person has entered, bringing with them a gust of cold air that reaches you even at your distant table. The person is a young man with a scarf wrapped around his neck, and he stamps his feet on the tile floor to remove the mud before entering the reading room. The other readers do not look up because they have learned to ignore such interruptions, and the young man finds a seat at the far end of a table and settles into the same stillness as everyone else. The cold air dissipates and the warmth of the room reasserts itself, and the quiet returns. You return your attention to the parliamentary report, and you read about the price of coal in a particular winter and the measures taken to distribute relief to a particular village. The details accumulate and blur together, and they create a background against which your own thoughts can drift without direction. You think about the canal and the waiting men and the oakum shed and the soup kitchen and all the other quiet spaces you have inhabited over the past days. These thoughts are not connected to the words on the page, but they coexist with them in a peaceful arrangement. The reading and the thinking and the listening to the soft sounds of the library all blend into a single activity that requires no effort. Your eyes grow heavy and you allow them to close for a moment. The darkness behind your eyelids is warm, and the sounds of the library continue to reach you. A page turns somewhere to your right, and a chair creaks, and the librarian coughs softly behind his desk. These sounds are comforting in their regularity, and they remind you that you are not alone, even as you drift in your private darkness. You open your eyes, and the parliamentary report is still before you open to the same page. You have not lost your place because you never truly had a place. You turn the page anyway, and you read another paragraph about another set of statistics that will fade from your memory as soon as you close the book. The afternoon is advancing and the light from the high windows has begun to take on the bluer tone that signals the approach of evening. The gas lamps seem brighter now in contrast, and their yellow glow dominates the room. The shadows beneath the tables have deepened, and the faces of the other readers have become harder to distinguish. The librarian rises from his desk and walks slowly around the room, lighting additional lamps that hang from the ceiling beams. He carries a long taper and he reaches up to each lamp and touches the flame to the wick, and a new pool of light appears. He moves with the same deliberate pace that you have observed in everyone who inhabits these quiet spaces, and his face is expressionless and calm. When he has lit all the lamps, he returns to his desk and resumes his reading. You close the parliamentary report, and you feel its weight in your hands one final time. The book has served its purpose, and you are ready to return it to the shelf. You rise from your chair and your legs are stiff from sitting, and you walk slowly across the room to the section where you found the volume. You slide it back into the gap on the shelf, and you pause for a moment with your hand still resting on its spine. The books around it press against one another, and they form a solid wall of knowledge and distraction and comfort. You let your hand fall to your side and you turn away from the shelf. Before you leave, you walk to the section near the fireplace where the leather chairs are arranged. One of the chairs has been vacated by its previous occupant, and you lower yourself into it. The leather is cool and smooth, and it yields beneath your weight with a soft sigh. The chair embraces you in a way that the straight-backed chairs at the tables do not, and you feel your body relaxing into its contours. The armrests are warm where countless hands have gripped them, and the seat has a depression that fits your shape, as if it was made for you. You lean your head back against the leather, and you close your eyes, and you listen to the library. The sounds are the same as before, but they seem closer and more intimate from this chair. You can hear the slow breathing of the man in the next chair, who has fallen asleep again. And you can hear the soft scratch of a pen nib on paper from somewhere near the window, where one of the women is making notes from a periodical. The librarian turns a page of his own book, and the sound is crisp and distinct. The gas lamps hiss softly overhead, and the flames dance slightly in draughts that you cannot feel. These sounds wrap around you and they create a cocoon of quiet that is deeper than any silence you have experienced elsewhere. You remain in the leather chair for a span of time that you do not measure. The warmth of the room, and the softness of the leather, and the steady rhythm of the library sounds combine to produce a state that is not quite sleep, but is something very like it. Your thoughts slow and become diffuse, and they drift through your mind like the steam on the ceiling of the soup kitchen. You are aware of the room, and the other readers, and the books on the shelves, but this awareness is distant and untroubled. You are simply present in a space that asks nothing of you and offers everything you need. When you finally open your eyes, the library has grown noticeably darker, despite the additional lamps. The evening has arrived in earnest, and the high windows show only a deep grey that is almost black. The other readers are beginning to gather their belongings and make their way toward the door. The man in the next chair has woken and is carefully marking his place in his book with a thin strip of paper. The women by the window are stacking their periodicals and pulling on their gloves. The librarian has closed his book and is standing by the door with a small key in his hand waiting to lock up for the night. You rise from the leather chair and the leather sighs as you leave it. Your body is heavy and relaxed and your mind is quiet. You walk toward the door and you nod to the librarian as you pass, and he nods in return. The cold air of the vestibule greets you, and then the colder air of the street. The gas lamps outside are burning, and they light your way as you begin the walk back to the lodging house. The library closes behind you, and its quiet remains inside, waiting for your return on another grey afternoon when the streets are too empty and the room is too small. You walk through the evening, and your footsteps echo on the cobblestones, and the sound is the only sound you need until you reach your door and the familiar creak of the stairs and the patient darkness of your room. The evening has settled into the lodging house like dust settling onto a tabletop, slow and inevitable and complete. You have returned from the library and climbed the creaking stairs and closed your door behind you, but the room felt too small after the high ceilings of the reading room and the warmth of the leather chair. You stood at the window for a time watching the gas lamps burn and the occasional figure pass beneath them, and then you turned away and opened your door again and descended the stairs to the common room on the ground floor. The common room is a space that belongs to all the tenants and to none of them. A long, low chamber at the back of the house with a stone floor and a small fireplace and a collection of mismatched chairs arranged in a rough circle around the hearth. You have come here on other evenings when the walls of your room began to press too close, and you have found a measure of comfort in the presence of other people who ask nothing of you except your silent company. The common room is occupied by 5 other tenants when you enter. They are arranged in the chairs near the fireplace, where a small fire burns with a steady orange glow. The fire is not large because coal is dear and the landlord provides only enough to take the edge off the damp, but it is sufficient to create a pool of warmth that the chairs encircle like wagons around a camp. The faces of the other tenants are familiar to you in the way that all faces become familiar after enough evenings spent in the same room. There is Mr. Harrow from the room above yours, a thin man with grey hair and a permanent stoop to his shoulders. There is Mrs. Bell, who occupies the room at the end of the hall and who rarely speaks but listens with a patient attention that makes her a favourite companion for those who wish to talk. There is young Thomas, who works when he can find work and who sits with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the fire. There is old Robert, whose age is unknown, but whose face is mapped with lines like the pages of a well-read book. And there is a man whose name you have never learned, a quiet presence who sits in the corner and nods along to whatever is said without ever contributing his own words. You take the empty chair that sits between Mrs. Bell and the fireplace. The chair is made of wood with a straight back and a seat that has been worn into a shallow depression by the weight of many previous sitters. You settle into it, and you feel the warmth of the fire on your left side, while your right side remains cool. The contrast is pleasant, and it gives you something to notice as the evening progresses. The fire makes a soft sound as it burns, a gentle crackle and pop that underlies the voices in the room without overwhelming them. The flames are small, and they dance in the grate, casting shifting shadows on the walls and on the faces of the people around you. The talk in the common room is already underway when you arrive. It is old Robert who speaks, and his voice is low and steady with a rhythm that invites neither interruption nor response. He is speaking about gardens and about the soil and about the proper way to prepare a bed for winter vegetables. You have heard him speak on this subject before on other evenings, and you know that he will continue for as long as anyone is willing to listen. The other occupants of the room have settled into their chairs with the relaxed postures of people who understand that they are not required to participate beyond the occasional nod or murmur of agreement. Mr. 5. Harrow has closed his eyes, but he is not sleeping because his head moves slightly in time with old Robert's words. Thomas stares at the fire with a fixed gaze that sees nothing in particular. Mrs. Bell has her hands folded in her lap and her expression is one of peaceful attention. Old Robert's voice continues, and you let it wash over you without trying to follow every word. He is describing the soil in the garden he once kept behind a cottage in a village whose name you have heard him mention before, but cannot now recall. The soil was heavy clay, he says, and it held the water too long in winter and cracked into hard plates in summer. The words come slowly with pauses between them, where old Robert seems to be seeing the garden in his memory, rather than in the room around him. He describes the way the clay clung to his boots after a rain, and the way it dried into a grey crust that had to be broken with a fork before anything could be planted. The fork he used was an old one, with a handle worn smooth by his father's hands before his own, and the tines were bent slightly from striking too many stones hidden in the heavy earth. The fire shifts, and the small piece of coal collapses into the ash with a soft sound. Old Robert pauses in his recitation and looks at the fire for a moment as if consulting it for confirmation of his memories. Then he continues, and his voice takes on a slightly different quality as he moves from the general condition of the soil to the specific matter of the turnip bed. The turnips were his particular pride, and he describes the preparation of the bed in detail that leaves nothing to the imagination. The ground had to be dug to a depth of 12 inches and no less because turnips send their roots deep and they will not thrive in shallow soil. The digging was done in the autumn, when the first frosts had broken the clay into smaller pieces, but before the ground had frozen solid. He worked with a spade that he sharpened himself on a whetstone kept in the shed, and he describes the sound of the spade cutting into the earth and the way the soil turned over in a single piece if the moisture was right. You let your eyes rest on the fire while old Robert speaks. The flames are orange and yellow, and they curl around the coal in shapes that change from one moment to the next. A small blue flame appears at the base of the fire and dances for a time before being swallowed by the orange. The warmth on your left side has become more pronounced, and you shift slightly in your chair to allow it to reach your shoulder. The movement is small, and it draws no attention from the others. Mrs. Marvel. Belle has turned her head toward old Robert, and she nods slowly as he describes the addition of manure to the turnip bed. The manure had to be well rotted, he explains, because fresh manure would burn the young roots and set the plants back by weeks. He obtained his manure from a farmer who kept cows in a byre at the edge of the village, and he carried it in a barrow that had a wheel that squeaked in a particular way. He describes the squeak of the wheel and the weight of the barrow and the smell of the manure, which he says was not unpleasant once you grew accustomed to it. Thomas shifts in his chair and his boot scrapes against the stone floor. Old Robert acknowledges the sound with a small pause and then resumes his description of the planting process. The turnip seeds were small and round and dark brown, and he kept them in a paper packet that had grown soft from being carried in his pocket. He would make a shallow drill in the prepared soil with the corner of his hoe, a tool that he describes in some detail, including the length of the handle and the shape of the blade and the way the wood had darkened where his hands gripped it. The seeds were dropped into the drill at intervals of 2 inches, because crowding would produce small misshapen roots that were good for nothing but the pig. He did not have a pig, but his neighbour had a pig, and there was an arrangement that involved the exchange of surplus turnips for the occasional loan of the neighbour's cart. The arrangement had never been formalised in words, but it had continued for years without any difficulty. The fire pops and the small spark flies out onto the stone hearth where it glows for a moment and then fades to black. Mr. Harrow opens his eyes and looks at the spark and then closes his eyes again. Old Robert has moved on to the subject of thinning the seedlings once they appeared above the soil. The seedlings came up in rows of pale green, with 2 small leaves that looked like butterflies resting on the earth. He would walk along the rows in the early morning when the dew was still on the leaves, and he would select the strongest plants to remain and pull up the weaker ones with a gentle tug. The pulled seedlings were tender and could be eaten in a salad if one was so inclined, though he preferred to leave them on the soil to wilt and return their goodness to the earth. The remaining plants were spaced at 6 inches, and this spacing allowed each turnip to develop into a perfect round shape with a purple top and a white bottom. You close your eyes and you see the garden that old Robert is describing. It is a small garden behind a stone cottage with a low wall separating it from the lane. The soil is dark and rich despite the clay, and the rows of turnip seedlings stretch across the plot in straight lines. The morning sun is just touching the tops of the plants, and the dew sparkles for a brief moment before evaporating. The air smells of earth and growing things, and the distant scent of wood smoke from the cottage chimney. The image is peaceful, and it requires no effort to maintain. You let it rest in your mind while old Robert's voice continues its slow narration. The growing season was a time of waiting and watching, he says. The turnips required little attention once they were established beyond the occasional weeding and the even more occasional watering if the summer was dry. He describes the weeds that grew in his garden with the same careful attention that he gives to the vegetables. There was chickweed that spread in low mats across the soil, and there was groundsel that grew tall and produced small yellow flowers that turned to white fluff. There was bindweed that twined around the turnip tops and had to be pulled away carefully so as not to disturb the roots. The weeding was done by hand, and it was a slow, meditative task that occupied many hours of many summer afternoons. He would kneel on a folded sack to protect his knees, and he would work his way along the rows, pulling each weed and placing it in a bucket that he carried with him. The bucket was made of galvanized metal, and it made a ringing sound when a stone struck its side. Mrs. Bell makes a small sound that might be a sigh of contentment, or might be simply an exhalation. The sound blends with old Robert's voice, and with the crackle of the fire, and with the distant creak of the house settling around you. The common room has grown warmer as the evening has progressed, and the warmth has made the air slightly drowsy. The man in the corner, whose name you do not know, has allowed his chin to drop toward his chest, and his breathing has become slow and regular. Thomas is still staring at the fire, but his eyes have taken on a glazed quality that suggests he is seeing something other than the flames. Mr. Harrow has definitely fallen asleep because his mouth is opened slightly, and a faint snoring sound emerges at regular intervals. Old Robert does not appear to notice the state of his audience. He has reached the part of his narrative that concerns the harvesting of the turnips, and his voice takes on a note of quiet satisfaction. The turnips were ready in the late autumn, when the first hard frosts had sweetened the flesh. He would walk out to the garden with a basket over his arm, and he would select the largest roots first, leaving the smaller ones to grow for another week or two. The turnips came out of the ground with a soft popping sound when he pulled them, and the earth clung to their skins in dark clumps. He would knock the earth off against the side of the basket, and the sound was a dull thud that he came to associate with the closing of the year. The harvested turnips were stored in a clamp in the corner of the garden, a mound of straw and earth that kept them fresh through the winter months. He describes the construction of the clamp in detail, including the proper thickness of the straw layer, and the angle of the ventilation hole, and the way the earth had to be packed firmly to keep out the frost. The fire has burned down slightly, and the orange glow has given way to a deeper red. The coals are still warm, and they continue to radiate heat into the room, but the flames are smaller and less active. Old Robert pauses in his description of the turnip clamp, and he leans forward to place another small piece of coal on the fire. The coal settles into the embers, and after a moment a new flame appears and begins to lick at its edges. Old Robert sits back in his chair and resumes his narrative without any acknowledgement of the interruption. The turnips were used in many ways throughout the winter months, he says. They could be boiled and mashed with a knob of butter, if butter was available, and a pinch of salt and pepper. They could be added to stews along with carrots and onions, and whatever meat could be obtained. They could be roasted in the ashes of the fire until their skins blackened and their insides turned soft and sweet. He describes the taste of a roasted turnip eaten on a cold evening, with the fire warm at his back and the wind rattling the window. The flesh was pale yellow, and it steamed when he broke it open, and the flavor was earthy and mild, with a sweetness that lingered on the tongue. He would eat it slowly because there was no reason to hurry, and because the warmth of the turnip seemed to spread through his whole body. Your own stomach makes a small sound at the description of the roasted turnip, and you are aware of the emptiness that has been your companion through much of the day. The sound is quiet, and it does not disturb old Robert's recitation. He has moved on to the subject of saving seeds for the following year, and he describes the process of selecting the best turnips to leave in the ground over winter. These turnips would send up tall flowering stalks in the spring, and the flowers would attract bees that buzzed in the garden with a sound like a distant engine. The pods that followed the flowers would be collected when they turned brown and dry, and the seeds would be shaken out onto a sheet of paper and stored in a cool, dark place until the autumn planting season came around again. The cycle of the garden repeats year after year in old Robert's telling, and the repetition is soothing in its predictability. The digging and the planting and the weeding and the harvesting and the saving of seeds all follow one another in an order that never varies. The turnips grow and are eaten, and new turnips are planted, and the garden continues whether old Robert is there to tend it or not. He speaks of the garden as if it still exists somewhere waiting for his return, though you know from things he has said on other evenings that the cottage is gone, and the village is changed, and the garden has long since been built over or returned to grass. The garden exists now only in his memory, and in the words that he offers to the quiet room on these long evenings. Old Robert's voice has grown softer as the evening has worn on. The words come more slowly now, with longer pauses between them. He has described the turnip bed in every season and in every condition of weather, and he seems to be searching for any detail that he might have overlooked. He mentions the way the rain collected in small pools on the broad leaves of the plants, and the way the sun caught these pools and made them shine like mirrors. He mentions the sound of the wind moving through the turnip tops, a rustling that was different from the rustling of other vegetables, because the leaves were thick and fleshy, and they rubbed against one another with a particular friction. He mentions the tracks of birds that walked across the soil between the rows, leaving 3-toed prints that filled with shadow in the low morning light. The fire has burned down again, and this time no one moves to add more coal. The red glow of the embers is sufficient to light the room with a dim warmth, and the faces of the other tenants are soft and shadowed. Mr. Stink and Mr. Soft. Harrow's snoring has become a steady background rhythm, and Thomas has allowed his head to fall back against the chair with his eyes closed. Mrs. Bell has not moved from her attentive posture, but her breathing has slowed and her hands have relaxed in her lap. The man in the corner is completely still and might be asleep or might simply be very deeply at rest. Old Robert's voice trails off into silence, and the silence that follows is comfortable and complete. The story of the turnips has reached its natural end, and there is nothing more to add. The common room holds the 6 of you in its quiet embrace, and the only sounds are the soft settling of the embers, and the distant drip of the tap in the washroom, and the faint murmur of the city beyond the walls. You remain in your chair for a time longer, and you feel the warmth of the fire on your left side, and the cool of the room on your right, and the weight of the evening pressing gently on your eyelids. Then you rise slowly and carefully, so as not to disturb the others, and you make your way to the door and up the stairs to your room. The talk of gardens and turnips follows you and settles into your mind like seeds planted in well-prepared soil, waiting for the quiet dark of sleep to begin their slow, invisible growth. The room receives you back into its darkness, and the door closes behind you with a soft click that is barely audible over the sounds of the house settling into night. You have climbed the stairs from the common room, where the embers of the fire still glowed, and where old Robert's voice had fallen silent at last. And now you stand in the familiar space of your own 4 walls, with the weight of the evening pressing gently against your shoulders. The candle stub on the windowsill has not been lit, because you have learned to navigate this room by touch and memory, and the darkness is not an absence but a presence that wraps around you like a second blanket. You remove your coat and hang it on the peg beside the door, where it will wait through the hours until morning, and you remove your boots and place them side by side near the foot of the bed, with their toes pointing slightly inward as they always do. The boards are cold beneath your stocking feet, and the cold is a familiar sensation that you accept without resistance. You lower yourself onto the bed, and the iron frame responds with a soft creak that is not a complaint, but an acknowledgement. The mattress receives your weight, and the straw within shifts and settles with a faint rustling sound, like the sound of a field of dry grass stirring in a distant wind. You lie back and your head finds the pillow, and the pillow holds the shape of all the nights that have come before this one. The blanket is rough against your chin when you pull it up, and the roughness is comforting, because it is the same roughness that you have felt every night since you first arrived in this room. You arrange the blanket so that it covers your shoulders and your chest and your legs, and you tuck the edges beneath you on both sides to hold the warmth close. The warmth of your body begins to accumulate in the small space between the blanket and the mattress, and you feel it spreading slowly outward from your center toward your hands and feet. The ceiling is invisible above you, and the watermark is invisible, and the faint swirls of plaster are invisible. They're all still there waiting for the grey light of morning to reveal them again, but for now they exist only in your memory and in the darkness that holds them safe. You let your eyes close, and the darkness behind your eyelids is slightly different from the darkness of the room. It is a warmer darkness with faint shifting shapes that are not quite colors and not quite light. These shapes are produced by nothing more than the activity of your own eyes, adjusting to the absence of stimulation, and you have watched them on many nights as you waited for sleep to arrive. They drift and pulse and fade and reform in patterns that have no meaning and require no interpretation. The lodging house begins to speak in its night voice. This voice is different from its day voice, which consists of footsteps and dripping taps and the distant murmur of the street. The night voice is softer and deeper, and it comes from within the walls and the floors and the ceiling rather than from the world outside. The first sound you notice is the slow, rhythmic creaking of the joists overhead as the weight of the roof settles into its nightly position. The timbers have been in place for more years than anyone in the house has been alive, and they have developed a language of their own that speaks of cooling air and contracting wood and the gradual release of the tensions that accumulate during the daylight hours. The creaks come at irregular intervals with long silences between them, and each creak is slightly different from the one before. Some are short and sharp like the snap of a small twig, and others are long and drawn out like a sigh that has been slowed to a fraction of its normal speed. Beneath the creaking of the joists, you can hear the softer sounds of the walls themselves. The brick and plaster hold the memory of the day's warmth, and as that warmth slowly radiates into the colder night air, the materials contract by fractions of an inch. This contraction produces tiny sounds that are almost too faint to hear, a fine crackling like the sound of paper being crumpled very slowly and very far away. The sounds come from all around you, and they have no discernible source or direction. They are simply the voice of the house breathing out after a long day of standing still. You have listened to these sounds on so many nights that they have become a kind of lullaby, a reassurance that the building is still standing and still holding you within its walls. The next sound comes from the room above, where Mr. Harrow is preparing for his own rest. You hear his footsteps cross the floor with the same pattern that you have memorized over the weeks, 3 steps from the bed to the washstand, and then a pause, and then 2 steps to the window, and then a longer pause. The footsteps are heavier than they are during the day because Mr. Harrow is tired and he no longer makes the effort to walk lightly. You hear the creak of his bed frame as he lowers himself onto his own mattress, and then you hear the soft thump of his boots being placed on the floor beside the bed. These sounds are familiar, and they mark the progress of the evening toward its final quiet. After the boots are placed, there is a long silence, and then you hear the faint rhythmic sound of Mr. Harrow's breathing as he settles into sleep. The breathing is slow and even, and it blends with the creaking of the joists to create a texture of sound that is both simple and complex. The walls that separate your room from the rooms on either side are thin, and they transmit sounds with a faithfulness that leaves nothing to the imagination. From the room to your left comes the sound of a person turning in their bed, a soft rustle of straw and blanket, followed by a sigh that speaks of tiredness and the search for a comfortable position. The turning happens once and then again after a short interval, and then a third time before the occupant finds the arrangement that allows them to rest. After the third turn, the sounds cease and are replaced by the same slow breathing that you hear from above. The breathing from the left room is slightly higher in pitch than Mr. Datar, Harrow's breathing, and it has a small catch at the end of each exhalation that you have noticed before and that you have come to expect. From the room to your right, there is no sound at all. The tenant who occupies that room is a person who sleeps in perfect silence, or perhaps a person who has not yet returned from wherever the evening has taken them. The silence on your right is a different quality of quiet than the silence of your own room, and you are aware of it as a presence rather than an absence. The house has many such silences, and they vary from room to room depending on who occupies them and what they bring with them into the night. Some silences are full and heavy like a blanket that has been folded many times, and some are thin and brittle like a pane of glass that might shatter at a loud sound. The silence on your right is a peaceful silence that asks nothing and offers nothing, and simply exists alongside you in the dark. The sounds of the house are joined now by the sounds of the city beyond the walls. These sounds are fainter and more distant, but they are always present if you listen for them. The gas lamps on the street outside cast their soft yellow glow through the window, and the glow is just bright enough to outline the frame against the deeper darkness of the room. You cannot see the lamp itself from your position on the bed, but you can see the rectangle of pale light that falls on the ceiling, and you watch it without watching it because your eyes are closed. The lamp makes no sound that you can hear, but you know that it is burning because of the quality of the darkness against your eyelids, which is not quite complete. Somewhere in the distance a dog barks. The sound is faint and it comes from many streets away, perhaps from the direction of the canal or from the warren of lanes behind the chapel. The bark is a single sharp note that rises and falls and then is swallowed by the night. You wait for a response from another dog, but none comes, and the silence that follows is deeper than the silence that came before. The dog has spoken its piece and returned to whatever dreams occupy the sleep of animals. You imagine the dog curled on a scrap of blanket in a yard or a doorway, its ears twitching at sounds that you cannot hear and its breathing slow and regular. A new sound reaches you from the direction of the main thoroughfare. It is the distant rumble of a cart making its way through the empty streets at an hour when most traffic has ceased. The cart moves slowly, and the sound of its wheels on the cobblestones rises and falls as it passes over the uneven surface. You can hear the iron rim striking the edges of the stones, and the slight clatter of the load shifting with each jolt. The horse's hooves make a 4-beat rhythm that is muffled by the distance, and you can almost feel the slow, plodding progress of the animal as it pulls its burden through the dark. The cart is likely the night soil cart making its rounds to collect the waste from the privies and cesspits of the district, a service that operates in the hours when respectable people are asleep and the streets are empty. The sound of the cart fades as it moves away from your street and towards some other part of the city, and the rumble becomes a murmur, and then a whisper, and then nothing at all. The house creaks again, and this time the creak comes from the wall behind your head. It is a slow groaning sound that seems to travel from the floor upward, through the plaster, and into the ceiling before it dissipates. The sound is caused by nothing more than the cooling of the bricks and the settling of the mortar, but it has a quality that makes it seem almost alive. You have heard this particular creak many times before, and you have come to think of it as the voice of the house saying good night. The creak is followed by a long silence, and then by another creak from a different part of the wall, and the two sounds are like the call and response of some slow conversation being conducted in a language that you do not speak, but that you understand nonetheless. Your body has grown heavy against the mattress, and the warmth beneath the blanket has spread to your hands and feet. The cold that you felt when you first lay down has receded and been replaced by a comfortable warmth that seems to come from within rather than from without. Your breathing has slowed to match the breathing of Mr. Ruthing, Harrow above, and the breathing of the tenant to your left, and the three rhythms blend together into a single pattern that rises and falls in the darkness. You are aware of your own breathing without making any effort to control it. The air enters your nose and travels down into your chest and then flows out again with a soft sound that is barely audible even to yourself. The cycle repeats, and each repetition is slightly slower than the one before. The sounds of the house continue their quiet chorus. The joists creak and the walls crackle, and the distant city murmurs beyond the glass. A new sound joins the others, and it is the soft pattering of water dripping from a leaky gutter onto the cobblestones below. The drip is irregular, and it comes in bursts of 2 or 3, followed by longer pauses. The sound is so faint that you can only hear it when you are not trying to hear it, and it fades in and out of your awareness, like a thought that you cannot quite hold. The water has probably collected from the damp air and the earlier mist, and it is finding its way down from the roof along paths that have been worn into the stone and the lead over many decades. The dripping will continue through the night and into the morning, and no one will notice it except those who lie awake in the dark listening to the house speak. You shift your position slightly, and the straw in the mattress rustles in response. The movement is small, and it does not disturb the blanket or the warmth that has accumulated beneath it. You turn your head on the pillow, and the pillow accepts the new position with a soft sigh of its own. The darkness behind your eyelids has become more uniform now, and the shifting shapes have faded into a single deep grey that is almost black. Your thoughts have begun to slow and to lose their connections to one another. They drift through your mind like the clouds you watched through the window on other afternoons, and they change shape and dissolve, and are replaced by new thoughts that have no more substance than the old ones. You think about the turnips that old Robert described, and you see them growing in neat rows in a garden that you have never visited. You think about the canal, and the slow water, and the barges that move with the patience of centuries. You think about the library, and the smell of old paper, and the weight of the parliamentary report in your hands. These thoughts are not connected, and they do not lead anywhere. They simply pass through you and fade into the darkness. The house has grown quieter now as the deepest part of the night approaches. The creaking of the joists has become less frequent, and the crackling of the walls has subsided into an almost perfect silence. Mr. Harrow's breathing continues overhead, and it has become slower and deeper as he descends into the layers of sleep that lie beyond dreaming. The tenant to your left has stopped turning, and their breathing has settled into a rhythm that matches the rhythm of the house itself. The silence on your right remains undisturbed, and you have stopped wondering about the occupant of that room, because wondering requires an energy that you no longer possess. You are suspended in a state that is not quite sleeping and not quite waking, a state in which the boundaries between your body and the room and the house and the city have become soft and indistinct. The faintest of sounds reaches you from the street below. It is the sound of the night soil cart returning along a different route, or perhaps a different cart making its own slow rounds. The rumble is so distant and so faint that you cannot be certain you are hearing it at all. It might be the echo of the earlier cart still reverberating in your memory, or it might be the sound of your own blood moving through your ears, or it might be nothing at all. The sound fades, and the silence that follows is complete, except for the breathing and the dripping and the soft settling of the ancient timbers. You let the silence wash over you, and you feel your body becoming heavier and heavier against the mattress. The blanket has grown warm from your body heat, and the warmth is a cocoon that holds you safe in the darkness. Your hands are loose at your sides, and your fingers are slightly curled in the way that fingers curl when they are completely at rest. Your jaw has relaxed, and your mouth has opened slightly, and your breathing passes in and out without any awareness on your part. The pillow has accepted the shape of your head, and it cradles you with a gentleness that asks nothing in return. The room around you has faded from your awareness, and only the sounds remain, the breathing and the dripping and the distant murmur of the sleeping city. You are almost there now. The place where sleep begins is not a sharp boundary, but a gradual slope that you've been descending since you first lay down and closed your eyes. The slope is gentle, and it leads downward into a darkness that is deeper and warmer than the darkness of the room. The sounds of the house follow you for a time, and then they too begin to fade. Mr. Harrow's breathing becomes a distant rhythm that you cannot quite hear. The dripping of the gutter becomes a memory of a sound rather than a sound itself. The creaking of the joists fades into the deeper creaking of the earth turning beneath the city. The last thing you hear before you let go entirely is the faintest whisper of the night soil cart passing 3 streets away. A sound so distant and so soft that it exists only at the very edge of hearing. The cart moves on, and the sound dissolves into the darkness, and you dissolve with it. The room remains, and the house remains, and the city remains. The watermark on the ceiling waits for the morning light, and the knot in the floorboard waits for your feet to find it again. The candle stub on the windowsill holds its small pool of hardened wax, and the tin of tea leaves rests on the table beside the enamel cup. All of these things will be there when you wake, and the grey light will seep through the window, and the factory whistle will sound in the distance, and the day will begin again. But that is hours away, and the hours belong to the sleeping world now. The house settles one final time with a creak that is almost too soft to hear, and then it too falls silent. The night holds you, and the quiet holds you, and the long, slow drift of sleep carries you away from the room, and the street, and the city, into a place where there are no sounds and no shadows and no waiting. You breathe in, and you breathe out, and the breathing becomes the only thing that remains. A soft, steady rhythm that continues without you. A small, faithful clock marking the passage of the hours until the grey light returns.